Chapter 563. On the first day of August, as usual, I am earnestly and sincerely pulling for monthly votes. Please give the monthly votes in your hands to me. I will write them seriously. I cannot promise they will be good, but I promise I will do my best. Thank you, everyone. After this obstruction, the Qin family rebel army's momentum was forced to a halt. Their formation, bound by the Jingdo streets, couldn't help but panic. At this moment, a number of explosive shouts rang out from within the army. At the first instant, a clear and powerful order was given, stabilizing the vanguard camp. Immediately after, the shield-holding soldiers caught up from behind. Stepping over the pools of blood on Chang Street, they bravely broke through the wooden doors of the private residences on both sides of the street and charged into those dark spaces. For a moment, the streets were filled with the sound of killing, but the true situation of the killing could not be seen. With a crash, a large hole opened up in a private residence. A rebel soldier covered in blood was stabbed to death and fell out. Inside those private residences, there were still countless soldiers and Overwatch Council subordinates lying in ambush, carrying out a dangerous killing. The rebel army's discipline was strict. When Qin Hung coldly gave the order to use the lives of a large number of soldiers as the price to launch a counterattack toward the two sides of the street, the rain of crossbows attacking from all directions weakened. A bright knife light flashed. Dozens of treacherous horse-tripping ropes on the stone pavement of the street were neatly cut. These black leather ropes were like poisonous snakes with their heads cut off. They lay limply on the ground. The poisonous needles, shining with a metallic luster, were like the shiny liquid on the snakeskin. Qin Hung sat on his horse and stared ahead under the military flag. Abruptly, he picked up the horsewhip in his hand and lashed it down forcefully. A fierce general at his side gave a muffled grunt. Holding a long spear in his hand, he yelled, "Kill!" His legs squeezed the horse's abdomen. Leading hundreds of riders, he once again charged toward Chang Street. For a moment, there was only the sound of horse hooves rolling up like wind and thunder with an imposing aura. There were still wretched cries on Chang Street. There were still the sounds of knives sinking into bones in the private residences, and the muffled sounds of bodies falling to the ground. It was difficult to see the figures of Overwatch Council subordinates. They only knew that these people were carrying out the killing work in the private residences on the side of the street. Gradually, blood seeped out from under the wooden doors. The fierce general of the Qin clan's vanguard camp ignored him and led his subordinates to charge on the long street. Only to see this person's long spear thrust out, stirring up a strong gust of wind, and with a cha sound, it pierced into a wooden door beside the horse. With a roar that shook the heavens, the general pulled back his spear. There was a black-clothed man on the spear. Fresh blood dripped from the spear. The tip of the spear had pierced through the chest of the Overwatch Council secret agent. The general under the armor released a muffled groan. With a shake of his arm, the corpse on the spear tip was flung out like a paper bag. He took the lead on a horse, and once again stepped over the corpses and pools of blood on the street. Once again he galloped forward. The black spear in his hand was completely forged from iron and steel. It was mighty and powerful, and the spear was not weak at all. Along the street, it actually picked up 5 wooden doors and killed several people in quick succession. Qin Hung stared coldly at his most ferocious general from the back. He waved his hand and ordered the entire army to press forward. He was prepared to use a powerful military force to directly suppress the Overwatch Council snipers on both sides of the street. Although they had lost nearly 200 soldiers in their first encounter, Qin Hung's state of mind did not tremble at all. He had never thought that the Overwatch Council's methods in the dark could directly stop the advance of a large army. An Overwatch Council official holding a crossbow appeared on the building in front of them on the left. Through the window, he took aim at the vanguard general. Unexpectedly, before he had time to pull the trigger, an arrow had already shot into his eye socket. The official gave a muffled groan and fell down the building. Immediately after, a series of whooshing sounds rang out. The dozens of bodyguards following the vanguard general on horseback on the street held light bows in their hands and shot to the left and right. Arrows flew out quickly. Immediately, many arrow holes appeared in the small buildings and private residences on both sides of the street. The Overwatch Council subordinates lying in ambush were preparing to use their crossbows to kill the vanguard general, when they were all struck and fell. Of the three powers in the world, the Qing army was the strongest in riding and shooting. At this moment, they were riding on the long street and holding hard bows in their hands. In an instant, the Overwatch Council crossbowmen didn't dare reveal themselves. Even though there were occasional arrows that flew out from the two sides, they did not seem to be very accurate. They hit the heavy armor on the vanguard general's body, but were unable to penetrate deep into his body. They only produced a few blooms of blood. In the blink of an eye, the Qin family general had already led the vanguard battalion to charge over 100 zhang, and behind him was the vast cavalry. In front of them was an open field, and there was no longer anything that could stop them from charging into the imperial palace. At this moment, a mournful signal arrow rang out on the long street. Pa 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 pa. The windows of the houses on both sides of the street were all closed. Although the killing in the houses continued, the long street had returned to peace. It was an extremely strange peace. The vanguard general's face was covered in blood and dirt. His expression was murderous. With a shake of his long spear, he pulled it behind his back. Like a mountain-splitting axe, he pierced toward the end of the street. Although he had noticed the strange scene on both sides of the street, he did not feel a glimmer of fear. Now that the charge had been formed, how could the Overwatch Council's tricks stop the advance of the army? Scoundrels, he thought disdainfully. Scoundrels. Qin Hung led the army and pressed toward the long street. With a stern expression, he looked at the street that had suddenly recovered its silence. He thought with slight mockery that the Overwatch Council still could not see the light of day. Right at this moment, a signal suddenly rang out on the long street that had regained its peace after the signal arrow. This signal only had one word. Ho! This ho was very simple. It was clean and tidy, but it contained boundless killing intent. Qin Heng's pupils constricted slightly. He raised his eyebrows. The rebel soldiers pulled back their bows. Countless arrows shot out, piercing toward the place where the order had come from. Thud, thud, thud. Like rain hitting a city, the wooden building was immediately pierced with countless holes. The long arrows pierced through the wind. There was only a faint muffled grunt. The Overwatch Council official who had given the order had died. Immediately after, there was only the sound of horse hooves, the muffled sounds of killing, and the sound of arrows piercing through the air. The order rang out again. Ho! Qin Heng's expression became gloomy. He held onto the reins and ran on the street. He didn't know what the Overwatch Council's ho meant. He could have chosen to split his forces and go around this section of the street where the Overwatch Council was heavily ambushed. He could have chosen a more reliable method. However, military orders were like a mountain. Since his father had ordered him to be the first to reach the royal palace, he had to maintain his speed, even if he had to pay an even greater price. Thus, he suddenly waved the whip in his hand. The thousands of rebel soldiers on the street shouted in unison, "Kill!" Like a flood, the group of lightly armored rebel soldiers charged toward the empty and dangerous street. The vanguard general, who no one dared to stop with a long spear in his hand, had already led the dozens of riders behind him to the end of the street. Behind him, Xingyang Gate glowed under the morning sun. The open space in front of him was attracting him. Further away, he could faintly see the royal palace still waiting for his attack. Thus he was filled with heroism and courage. Then, he suddenly heard the thunderous sound of hooves. Then, he saw that at the empty end of the long street, over 200 cavalry had suddenly appeared. These cavalry had appeared at some point in time. They wore bright armor and held long blades in their hands. They silently and coldly waited for the rebel army to arrive. Beside these cavalrymen, there were more than 10 scattered corpses. They were the 10 or so scouts sent out by the Qin clan's rebel army. Not only were the scouts dead, but even the war horses had fallen to the ground. The Qin vanguard general's pupils constricted. He knew these riders were tough. Otherwise, they could not have killed a dozen of his subordinates without making a sound. It was the imperial army. He could no longer stop. The vanguard general gripped the metal spear in his hand tightly. The roughness and coldness of the spear made him feel boundless confidence. Then he squeezed his horse's belly and led the dozens of riders behind him toward the Imperial army. The Imperial Army general's entire body was covered in armor. Only his eyes were exposed. There was not a glimmer of emotion in these eyes. There was only calmness, coldness, and determination. The coldness toward his own life, and the determination to complete the mission the commander had given him. He raised the saber in his hand high. The edge of the blade flashed with light, making one shiver. He squeezed his horse's belly. The warhorse under him suddenly struggled and shot out like an arrow from a bow. Just like that, the hundreds of cavalrymen charged forward with indomitable courage. They were like two different colored torrents that were about to collide head-on. Just at this moment, an Overwatch Council order suddenly rang out on the long street that had just been silent for a moment. Release! The Qin Vanguard general's eyes were blood-red as he watched the Imperial Army riders charging toward him at high speed. With an explosive roar, his horse suddenly sped up. He was just about to charge out of the street when he suddenly heard this sound. His state of mind was firm and ruthless. There was not a glimmer of panic or slowing down. He didn't care at all about the scoundrels of the Overwatch Council. What he cared about was the valiant Imperial Army in front of him. He had to open a bloody path for the general, and a bloody path to the royal palace. A black shadow was thrown out from a private residence by the side of the street. It just happened to appear in the air in front of the Vanguard general's horse. The Vanguard general raised his elbow. The tip of the spear flashed. With a ripping sound, the black shadow was immediately torn to shreds. Cloth flew wildly. The powder inside was swept into the air. Some of it landed on the Vanguard general's body, but most of it landed on his horse. He held his breath. His eyes were blood-red. He knew that the Overwatch Council's use of poison was powerful, but he was not afraid. As long as the poison did not enter his heart for a moment, he would be able to force back the approaching Imperial Army. However, he was worried about his horse. Stealing his heart, he struck the back of the spear viciously against the horse's rump. The horse was startled and sped up again. A series of springs rang out. On the street that had been calm for a long time, the crossbow bolts came again. The Qin Vanguard general huffed coldly and swung his spear to protect his vitals and the head of his horse. A gust of wind swept out. Countless crossbow bolts fell to the ground. Occasionally, a few bolts hit his armor. With a crisp clang, they fell powerlessly to the ground. This Vanguard general abruptly discovered that among the rain of crossbow bolts, there were a few smears of unlucky red. Red? Fire? With a swish, 3 crossbow bolts landed separately on the Vanguard general's heavy armor and the head of his horse. The crossbow bolts had fire cotton tied to them and were burning with tiny flames. In the red morning sun, they were not obvious, but they were particularly fatal. The moment the flames touched the powder on the heavy armor, they began to burn with a whoosh. From the horse's head to the heavy armor, and then to the helmet. Wherever it touched the powder, the flames immediately spread. In the blink of an eye, the fire burned fiercely and enveloped the Vanguard general in flames. Asterisk chi-chi. Asterisk a terrible roar came from the flames. At this time, the Vanguard was still maintaining his charging posture. But he had already become a burning torch. He roared in terror and threw away the spear in his hand, trying to put out the fire on his body. However, this had already become something he could never do. The fire the Overwatch Council had set was not so easy to put out. He knew he was done for. His heart was filled with incomparable terror. The horse was in great pain and let loose a wild gallop. Shrouded in flames, the rider and horse charged terrifyingly to the front of the Imperial Army's front line. The general of the Imperial Army looked coldly and mockingly at the man on fire charging toward him. As the two riders passed each other, he swung his long knife with a flash. The knife came out without a sound. It passed through the fire and chopped off the head of the Vanguard general. With a crack, the head broke off. Tied by the neck armor, it burned in the flames. The flaming horse let out a mournful cry as it charged blindly, carrying its headless master. It crashed head first into an alley wall on the side of the street. With an extremely heavy muffled sound, both the horse and the master fell to the ground, neighing miserably. No one looked at them. There were only 200 or so riders of the Imperial Army. At this moment they maintained a very high speed. They stepped over the bodies of the vanguard soldiers that had been shot into beehives and burned into charcoal. They charged toward the center of the army where Qin Hung was. Qin Hung didn't know what kind of shameless and sinister murder his most valued vanguard had suffered. After hearing the Overwatch Council's second call for an order, he had already ordered his army to begin pressing toward the two sides of Chang Street, because the Overwatch Council's second attack had already begun. After a long silence and the two cold calls for an order, the rain of crossbow bolts fired toward the rebel soldiers became even more intense. Most of them were aimed at the center of the military flag, particularly where Qin Heng's personal camp was. "It's a repeating crossbow." Finally, a rebel soldier cried out timidly. Amidst the howling of crossbow bolts breaking through the wind, this cry was particularly heart-shaking. Do 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 do. A series of densely packed strikes rang out. The first arrow was blocked, but what about the second and third? A dozen personal soldiers bravely stood in front of Qin Heng's horse. They only had elbow shields in their hands. It was not enough to block such a dense and fast crossbow bolt. They used their bodies and the large bodies of their warhorses to act as meat shields for Qin Hung. On Chang Street, people and horses were thrown off their feet. Tragic cries rang out repeatedly. Countless rebel soldiers had crossbow bolts stuck into their faces. Fresh blood and sweat mixed together. Everywhere there were cries for help. In just an instant, most of the soldiers around Qin Hung had died. Qin Hung knew that the Overwatch Council's target was him. His face was covered in blood and dirt. His expression appeared particularly sinister amidst the blood and dirt. It was not until this moment that he finally confirmed that Fan Xian had the Overwatch Council lie in ambush at Jingyang Gate, not just to block and stall for time. He was prepared to put his life on the line, to keep his life here. Although he didn't know why Fan Xian valued his life so much, he was stern and fearless. He only looked at the initially calm Chang Street, which was now filled with the sound of crossbow bolts, and his subordinates bravely and helplessly fighting against the poisonous powder and hidden crossbow bolts. A vein appeared on his temple. A wave of anger filled his chest. These scoundrels only knew how to use such unorthodox methods. Did they dare to delude themselves into trapping him? He pulled out the long sword at his waist and squeezed his horse's belly. The horse leaped like a dragon, and leaped out amidst the crossbow bolts. He roared, "For the Qing Kingdom kill." The commander began to risk his life to charge the formation. The morale of the rebel soldiers rose greatly. In unison they cried out "kill," and charged deep into the two sides of the street through the rain of crossbow bolts. They used their bodies and lives to slightly suppress the Overwatch Council's second wave of attacks. After all, the rebel soldiers had the advantage of numbers. As long as they could come into direct contact with the Overwatch Council officials hiding in the darkness, they would obtain the final victory. However, at this moment, the Imperial soldiers at the other end of the street had already charged over. There were only 200 riders, but it was like there were 2,000. Thunder rumbled, and a murderous aura surged. Their power could not be stopped. Like a flood, they charged into the Qin family army, which had already been forced to scatter. Both sides wore armor, and had knives in their hands. Murderous intent boiled to the heavens. Although the Qin family army's formation was a bit messy, on the not very wide Chang Street, this was a head-on collision with no path of retreat. The two cavalries, which were advancing at high speed, had their first head-on collision on the long street below Jingyang Gate. Like two large iron hammers, they fiercely smashed into each other, giving rise to an ear-piercing and incomparably terrifying loud sound. In an instant, countless riders fell from their horses and were trampled. The people on the horses were stabbed to death, squeezed to death, chopped to death, or shaken to death. Knives and spears collided, armor collided, and auras collided. Qin Hung looked at this scene with an ashen face. He wondered how many people Fan Xian and the Great Prince had to have so many people lying in ambush below Jingyang Gate. "I've smashed all the soldiers that can move inside Jingyang Gate." Fan Xian stared at the smoke in Jingdo and said with a heavy expression, "Although I hadn't guessed that they would be so powerful as to enter from 9 city gates, since they have smashed inside Jingyang Gate, I had to make some noise." The Great Prince glanced at him, and then at the gradually approaching rebel army flags in the Jingdo streets. He couldn't help his pupils constricting slightly. In the end, it is only one path. The general trend cannot be reversed. In that instant earlier, if you had charged out from inside Jingyang Gate, perhaps you would have had a chance to break out. The eldest princess must have backup troops outside Jingdo, Fan Xian said. Break out? What would I use to break out? Didn't Jinggu take 200 black knights and disappear from Jingdo? The great prince glanced at him. Fan Xian didn't reply. He only looked at the square below the royal palace with a heavy expression. This square was very large. During the military parade, tens of thousands of people had lined up. At this moment he could faintly feel the ground trembling. Presumably, the 8 paths of rebel soldiers were about to surround them. Even though he had long seen through the concept of life and death, he couldn't help but feel his heart begin to tremble. He raised his head and looked in the direction of Jingyang Gate. He knew that the strength that he and the great prince had left outside the palace was mostly concentrated in that path. Regardless of who wanted to reach the palace from there, they would probably have to pay a heavy price. If he knew that it was the second-generation leading figure of the Qin family who was, at this moment, struggling to advance through crossbow bolts and poisonous smoke, he would probably laugh out loud. Fan Xian had always firmly remembered the Qin family's attack in the valley. However, he didn't know how many of those loyal Overwatch Council subordinates, as well as the Imperial Army's suicidal cavalry, would survive a moment later. Just as the great prince had said, a mere city gate was not enough to change the general trend. At the foot of the royal palace, a rider appeared at the corner of the street at the edge of the square. At this moment, the Imperial Army had all gathered into the palace. The square outside the palace gates was completely empty. Thus, the rider's appearance was very abrupt. It was as if a discordant black dot had suddenly appeared in the empty space. Amidst the clattering of horse hooves, the rider did not stop to rest. From the edge of the square, he charged straight to the center of the square and came to the front of the royal palace. Behind this cavalryman, a second cavalryman appeared, a third cavalryman, a 10th cavalryman, a 100th cavalryman, a 1000th cavalryman. 8 of the Qin and Yi families' armies, after sweeping away any resistance along the way, finally arrived in front of the imperial city, like a dark cloud pressing down on the city. The densely packed rebel soldiers silently and coldly surrounded the entire royal palace. The murderous aura seeping through the silence, and the steady aura, made the hearts of the imperial soldiers on the palace walls tremble for no reason. Fan Xian and the great prince finally stopped chatting to hide the nervousness in their hearts. They silently watched everything in front of them. A moment later, a flag fluttering in the morning wind appeared in everyone's field of view. This flag came from the corner of the square on the long street. A large Qin character was revealed on it. Another rider came swiftly from the other side of the palace walls. In his hand was a large flag with the Yi character written on it. The last thing that appeared was a bright yellow flag. There was not a single word on it. There was only a dragon soaring through the clouds embroidered with golden thread. Its golden claws shattered the auspicious clouds as it stepped through the air. Even the dragon flag has been openly displayed. Fan Xian was silent for a long time before he finally spoke. The Qin and Yi family armies were too powerful. Although he was a 9th-level ace, and had an incomparably firm temperament, he still couldn't help but feel his scalp tingle when faced with the densely packed army. Are you afraid? The great prince looked at him expressionlessly. Anything will appear terrifying when there are too many of them. Ants are like this, mice are like this, cockroaches are like this, much less people. Fan Xian summoned a subordinate and said a few words. The 3 large flags moved slowly, under the burning gazes of the rebel soldiers around the square, and the slightly fearful gazes of the Imperial Army guards. They came to the front of the royal palace. They came behind the first rider to enter the square, and fluttered in the wind. You've been stubbornly refusing to break through. I always thought you still had some trump card up your sleeve. The great prince said slowly as he looked at the riders and flags in front of the royal palace with narrowed eyes. My trump card is long gone, Fan Xian said without changing his expression. Fan Xian's expression did not change as he said, but I always thought that those old fellows wouldn't just leave us to die. I always thought that since the rebel army had already entered the city, they would jump out and pretend to be super science. Unfortunately, it seems that I guessed wrong. What are science? The great prince twitched the corner of his mouth. I am also very confused. Has Director Chen really been poisoned? Fan Xian looked at the mountainous army in front of the royal palace and suddenly took a deep breath. Slapping the bricks of the royal palace, he said, "Even if it's the two of us, so what?" The great prince looked at him deeply and said, "I don't want to die with you." The storm was coming, and the buildings were filled with worry. The two worried people in the corner of the royal palace were joking. The surrounding imperial army soldiers secretly watched this scene and listened to the duke and commander's hearty laughter. For some reason, they also felt that the rebel soldiers in front of the royal palace were not as terrifying as they had imagined. The great prince looked at the three lonely flags in front of the royal palace and the rider at the very front. He smiled slightly and said, "They are using their aura to suppress us and try to make the imperial army afraid. My subordinates would not be so cowardly. Why did we throw all the cards in our hands at Jingyang Gate?" Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and looked at the four riders standing in front of the royal palace. It was to kill the enemy's spirit and raise the morale of our army. Then, how could we allow these four riders to stand so arrogantly in front of the royal palace as a demonstration? According to military tradition, the first rider to arrive will receive unparalleled glory. Fan Xian stared at the rider like a black dot. A moment later he suddenly said, "Then let him lose his glory." The great prince furrowed his brows. As the commander of the Western Expedition Army, he had a natural respect for the Qing Kingdom's military tradition. Although he greatly disliked the riders silently showing off their strength in front of the royal palace, he had never thought of doing anything. Furthermore, they were standing in a good position. It would be difficult for arrows to reach them. Fan Xian said resolutely and decisively, "I am not a soldier. I also don't understand glory. I only know that this is a matter of life and death. To still stand in front of me at this time, that is..." Before he finished his sentence, his hand had already swung down. The city guarding crossbow in the corner of the royal palace, that had been silent for countless years, suddenly let out a wretched cry. It was as if it wanted to wake up all the resentful spirits that had once died in the royal palace. Click! After the loud sound of a spring, a crossbow bolt as thick as a child's arm left the crossbow mechanism like lightning and shot out along a preset trajectory. The riders and banners standing alone in front of the royal palace were lonely but arrogant. They looked coldly and disdainfully at the imperial soldiers on the palace walls, conveying a powerful intimidation and pressure. All of this was broken by the sound of the crossbow. The first rider to enter the boundaries of the royal palace didn't even have time to raise his head before the massive crossbow bolt pierced through his body and into the body of his warhorse. Accompanied by a large spray of blood, the man and horse were ruthlessly nailed to the stone tiles of the square. Chapter 564. The arrow of the city guarding crossbow was like a short spear. It pierced through the flesh and blood of man and horse, piercing deeply into the cracks between the stone tiles of the square. The fine iron arrow, as thick as a child's arm, trembled endlessly and made a buzzing sound. It brought the blood of the rider's body under the arrow with it. Many people were unable to react, including the rebel army and the imperial guards on the palace walls. Tens of thousands of people stared dumbly at this scene, not daring to believe their eyes. Such a huge crossbow bolt had pierced through the cavalry's body. It was more like an iron rod from the heavens, ruthlessly smashing down from beyond the clouds. A death-like silence and an icy fear spread through the square. On the rider's body that had fallen gloriously, the three banner-holding officers also did not react. They looked stupidly at the rider in front of them, who had become bloody foam, and the internal organs that had been squeezed out of the ground. They didn't know how to react. Horses were different from humans, even though they were war horses that had been chosen out of 10,000. When they saw this scene and felt the fear of that crossbow arrow, their biological instincts made the three horses neigh in unison. After being startled, they began to gallop to the side. A moment later, two military flags fluttered in the morning wind. They returned wretchedly to the rebel army's camp. The other bright yellow dragon flag fell miserably to the flat ground of the square and rolled up into a ball. It looked very unsightly. The soldier holding the flag had been startled by the city-guarding crossbow. The warhorse under him had also galloped in fright. For a moment, he lost his grip and dropped the dragon flag to the ground. The tens of thousands of Qing soldiers on and off the palace walls were still death-like silent. However, their gazes had moved from the bloody mud in the square to the flag. The dragon flag that represented the dignity of the Qing royal family and the Qing army's undefeatable will. This flag that seemed to always fly in front of the army and would not fall had fallen miserably to the ground. The emotions in the tens of thousands of eyes were complicated, angry, and not right. On the palace walls, Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and watched this scene. He smiled slightly at the great prince beside him and said, "The effect is good, isn't it?" The great prince did not reply. He thought to himself, the crown prince had raised troops today, yet he had even lost the dragon flag. He had truly embarrassed himself. The imperial soldiers on the palace walls suddenly exploded into cheers in unison. These cheers were, without a doubt, a ruthless whip in the faces of the tens of thousands of rebel soldiers below the palace walls. At that moment, the empty-handed cavalryman who had lost his flag had already returned to the rebel army's camp. He sat on his horse with his head lowered, trembling all over. He knew that he would face severe punishment from the military. As a flag-bearer, this was an honorable position, yet he had accidentally dropped the dragon flag to the ground. The hundreds of riders in the rebel army camp gradually parted. Crown Prince Li Chengqian, dressed in bright armor, slowly walked out under the protection of a few generals. He only glanced at the rider and didn't say anything. The crown prince's gaze was very gentle, but the cavalryman felt extremely ashamed. He gritted his teeth and turned his horse around, preparing to go to the square to snatch back the dragon flag that had fallen to the ground. It did not matter even if he died. At this moment, to everyone's surprise, a general beside the crown prince spurred his horse forward and came to the side of the cavalryman. He said, "When two armies cross swords, the one who loses the flag will be beheaded." The moment the word beheaded left his mouth, the cavalryman's body trembled. He unconsciously closed his eyes, but did his best to straighten his body. Then he felt a chill on his neck. The general pulled back his knife and didn't even glance at the fallen body of the cavalryman beside him. He squeezed out a cold snort from his nose and squeezed the sides of his horse. The handsome horse beneath him shot forward like lightning. In an instant, it galloped out of the rebel army camp and headed straight for the center of the square below the palace walls. It was headed straight for the dragon flag that was curled up on the ground. Not everyone in the tens of thousands of rebel soldiers recognized this general, but they knew what he was going to do. Involuntarily, their hearts trembled and their blood surged. Tens of thousands of people roared in unison and rhythmically. Amidst the iron-blooded and awe-inspiring cries of the tens of thousands of people, the warhorse beneath the general was like a flying dragon. Its four hooves seemed to rise into the air as it pierced toward the palace walls like a sharp arrow. Riding alone in the open square under the gaze of tens of thousands of people, and the piercing of crossbow bolts on the palace walls, it was very heroic. The speed of the horse was very fast. The rider's skill in controlling the horse was even more impressive. It looked like it was charging in a straight line toward the palace walls. In reality, it was following a strange path. Although it took some detours, it was full of vigor. In only a moment, it had charged to the center of the square. Until now, not a single one of the city-guarding crossbows had been fired. The Imperial soldiers and Overwatch Council soldiers beside the giant city-guarding crossbows broke out in a cold sweat. It was impossible for them to capture the path of the rebel general's advance. Even under such high speed, it seemed that he could still keenly capture the speed of fire and defensive range of the city-guarding crossbows. Fan Xian stared at this scene with narrowed eyes. He felt that in the blink of an eye, this rebel general had already charged to his feet and in front of the dragon flag. The city-guarding crossbows had just demonstrated their power once, and this rebel general had already charged over. Such vigor and courage was truly admirable. For some reason, Fan Xian suddenly thought of 13th Wang. His heart jumped slightly, He was just about to raise his hand when he used a great deal of willpower to order himself to slowly lower it. This small action did not fall into the eyes of the great prince, because he was also watching the one-man show of two armies fighting for power in front of the palace walls with a stern expression. When two armies cross swords, vigor was the most important. The flag was the power. Capturing the flag was capturing the power. The rebel general on the horse rode to where the dragon flag was. He did not slow down. Using superb riding skills, he hung one foot on the pedal and reached down with one hand. Easily, he picked up the dragon flag. Although Fan Xian had lowered his arm, the group responsible for operating the city-guarding crossbows did not want to pass up this great opportunity. They pulled on the heavy spring of the crossbow mechanism. With a muffled bang, the thick palace walls seemed to tremble with the release of the giant crossbow. The neigh of a horse rose into the sky. The rebel general below the palace walls seemed to have guessed when the city-guarding crossbows would fire. He raised the reins and kicked his beloved horse's abdomen with both feet. With a wild roar, he had the horse stand up on its hind legs. The warhorse's front hooves hung in the air as its massive body was forcefully twisted. It even hovered in the air in a stupefying manner. The rebel general held the bright yellow dragon flag in one hand and fiercely raised the reins in the other. He sat diagonally on the rearing warhorse. Illuminated by the morning sun, he appeared heroic and fierce. At this moment, the giant city-guarding crossbow finally arrived in front of them and brushed past the warhorse's abdomen. It stabbed down diagonally and viciously. The iron crossbow, as thick as a child's arm, pierced into the stone slabs of the square. Shattered stones flew everywhere, but it did not even graze a hair on the rebel general's body. The rebel general twisted his left elbow and pulled in the reins again. The head of the horse under him turned to the left. With a neigh, its two hooves landed on the ground. All the muscles in its body relaxed and tightened. Like a wisp of smoke, it galloped directly back to the rebel army camp and back to the crown prince's side. The rebel general did not dismount. He only heavily stabbed the bright yellow dragon flag into the ground. The flagpole entered the ground, but did not fall. The dragon flag once again fluttered in the morning wind and shone brilliantly. Then, he turned his horse's head and was silent as he looked at the two black dots on the palace walls. In just a few breaths, this rebel general had done what most people could not do. From the moment he leaped out of the camp, tens of thousands of rebel soldiers began to cheer. As he took back the dragon flag and galloped back to the camp, tens of thousands of people's mountainous cheers grew louder and louder. When this rebel general stabbed the dragon flag back into the ground, and the flag fluttered in the wind, the cheers of the rebel soldiers finally reached a climax. Impressive. Fan Xian gently wiped away the cold sweat on his palms. At this moment, he expressed an opinion that he should not have expressed as one of the commanders. There are indeed countless fierce generals in the Qing army. No wonder no one can defeat them unhindered under heaven. Fan Xian smiled slightly and said, "It's Gong Dian. He has been the deputy commander of the Imperial Army for so many years. His understanding of the city-guarding crossbow is much better than yours or mine. Furthermore, he is an 8th-level ace. Given his noble status as a general, he bravely risked his life to take back the flag. Such courage is truly admirable." The great prince furrowed his brows slightly and said, "So it's him. No wonder, no wonder. General Gong has been herding horses on the borders of Dingzhou since he was young. His riding skills came from the Hu people, and he is known as the best in the army." This was not the first time Fan Xian had heard of Gong Dian's background. He looked calmly at the rebel army's camp and found that most of the people around the crown prince were generals of the Qin family. It seemed that only Gong Dian had appeared in the Dingzhou family. Gong Dian was the previous deputy commander of the Imperial Army and Minister of Guards. He had once been a trusted subordinate of the Qing Emperor. However, because of the Qing Emperor's suspicions toward the Yi family, he chose to use the Hanging Temple matter and chose a groundless reason to throw Gong Dian into prison. Fan Xian had been involved in the Hanging Temple matter from beginning to end and had been heavily injured once. There were many secrets inside that he still did not understand. However, he knew that because of the emperor's paranoia, He had no idea how much terrifying opposition he had brought to Jingdo. Fan Xian's heart jumped again. The eldest princess, Chen Pingping, and Lin Ruofu had both said on different occasions that the emperor did not have any major weaknesses. It was only because of his paranoia that he could be defeated. The great prince suddenly raised his head and said, "It's a draw." Fan Xian nodded. He knew what the great prince meant by a draw. The rebel army had surrounded the palace. Given the palace's defensive power, it would not be able to hold out for more than a few days. Thus, they had to use the most direct method, at the very beginning, to strike at the rebel army's morale. Although they did not have the extravagant hope that they would be able to take the flag and steal their morale, they could at least make it so that they would not be able to charge in one go and create a relatively slow process. That was why there was the wretched killing in front of Zhengyang Gate, and the first use of the city-guarding crossbows in half a century. Even if it was only aimed at one person, it had to make the rebel army's hearts tremble. However, Gong Dian's confident capture of the flag caused this momentum to turn back. Fortunately, although the rebel army was once again full of vigor, looking at the other party's formation, they should not attack immediately. The rebel army had a clear advantage. Why didn't they attack immediately? Fan Xian could calculate a few points. The royal palace had a natural advantage in defense. The city walls were tall and thick, and the crossbows were united. The power in the palace was already at a dead end. If the rebel army attacked, this kind of destructive power that would rise from a dead end forced the crown prince to reconsider. The more important question was, who would attack? Although the heavenly soldiers and generals I've been hoping for have yet to arrive, Fan Xian said to the great prince with a warm smile. I think the rebel army actually has a headache. They are not a monolithic bloc. Nominally, the Yi and Qin families both support the crown prince. But what does the crown prince think? Yi Zhong is the second prince's father-in-law. He raised his hand and pointed to a military horse far to the right and said, "The second prince and Yi Zhong should be over there." Do you think the crown prince is willing to let the Qin family charge and break through the enemy lines and let the second prince take advantage? The great prince said calmly. Of course, the second prince is also unwilling to let his father-in-law go out. He has many things on his mind. If the last bit of capital is used up, presumably, he knows very well how Chengqian will deal with him in the future. Exactly. Fan Xian gently patted the green brick wall of the royal palace and looked at the rebel army camp slowly moving toward the royal palace. In a quiet voice he said, "Our two brothers both have ulterior motives. If we don't discuss it, we won't fight. Of course, no matter how you look at it, they are lions and we are antelopes. They don't want to lose too many people, so they will certainly urge us to surrender," Fan Xian said with his head lowered. The crown prince is a gentle person. The crown prince was fighting in the name of righteousness. He was not here to rebel. If he didn't say a few dignified words and just fought like this, wouldn't he be preparing to receive guests before the memorial archway was properly opened? Fan Xian was certain that this was something the rebels would never do. So he quietly waited for the crown prince, Li Chengqian, to speak. Tens of thousands of rebel soldiers had already gathered. Forming into a formation, they slowly pressed toward the royal palace. The black mass was like a dark cloud pressing down on the city, making one's heart palpitate. The black cloud-like rebel soldiers stopped 2 arrows away from the royal palace. Among the sea of people, a number of people slowly rode out from the rebel army camp. It was the crown prince and the important generals beside him. Beside the crown prince were the generals of the Qin family. Gong Dian, who had shown his confident hand earlier, was 2 riders away. Fan Xian watched this scene with narrowed eyes and saw much of the content clearly. Gong Dian following the crown prince was certainly an expression of the Yi family's loyalty. However, the crown prince did not have much trust in the Yi family. To the crown prince's right was the old Qin master. This old man had once again donned his armor for battle and put on the armor he hadn't worn for a long time. His old face was filled with a murderous aura accumulated on the battlefield for countless years. His usually muddy eyes stared at the juniors on the royal palace like an eagle. There was no sign of age. Given the old Qin master's position and authority in the Qing palace, He was, without question, the core leader of the rebel army. The Empress Dowager trusted him, and the Crown Prince also trusted him. He had also given the Empress Dowager and the Crown Prince sufficient support. However, a few strands of white hair seeped out from the armor. Blown by the Jingdo morning wind, he appeared somewhat lonely. Fan Xian's eyesight was very good. He looked silently at the elder of the Qing military. For some reason, he thought of when he watched the 1998 World Cup in his previous life. After the semi-final between Brazil and Holland, Zagallo had walked against the wind by the side of the field. His few strands of white hair had been blown into a miserable state. He was not letting his mind wander. He was just unconsciously remembering that scene. Fan Xian took a deep breath and thought to himself, Zagallo's meritorious service for generations. After winning that battle, he still ended up with a miserable ending. How could the old Qin master be an exception? The old Qin master, who was being cursed by Fan Xian, glanced at the crown prince and slowly opened his mouth to speak to the imperial soldiers on the palace walls. You are soldiers of the Qing kingdom. How dare you help Fan Xian, a regicide? Prince Huqing, listen to my orders. The moment the old Qin master opened his mouth, the air in the square above the royal palace began to buzz. Fan Xian's pupils constricted. He and the great prince met each other's eyes. They both saw the fear in each other's eyes. The old Qin master had a powerful cultivation and profound martial power. Fan Xian quietly wiped the sweat from his palms on the bricks. He had long guessed who the true warrior of the Qin family was. No matter what, he had never thought that the 9th level hidden deep in the Qin family would be the old Qin master himself. That old and weak man was actually a superior 9th level super warrior. This reality immediately charged into Fan Xian's heart and made his expression become ugly. He was indeed worthy of his great reputation. The Qin family had dominated the world for decades. The old Qin master had always sat in the position of the foremost person in the Qing military. Even the incomparably arrogant Yin Xiaoyi was incomparably respectful to him. There was indeed a reason for this. Fan Xian's right index finger began to tremble slightly, not out of fear, but out of excitement. In the beginning, it had been very difficult to snipe Yin Xiaoyi. Now that he had sniped this old man, presumably, his sense of accomplishment would be even stronger. When he glanced at Gong Dian, who was silently following in the rebel army's camp, his right index finger once again recovered its calm. He shouted toward the foot of the palace walls, Qin Yi. The old Qin master had not finished his first sentence when Fan Xian had already shouted out these two words. These two words were mixed with his tyrannical zhenqi. Although it was not as thick and grand as the old Qin master's voice, it was particularly violent. It immediately suppressed the old Qin master's voice. The tens of thousands of people on and below the palace walls all turned their gazes toward Fan Xian on the palace walls. The old Qin master furrowed his brows slightly. It seemed that he had not expected the tyrannical zhenqi in Fan Xian's body to be this powerful. He had also not expected to hear the name he had not heard in a long time below the palace walls. Qingyi? In this world, other than the Empress Dowager, who else dared to call him this? Fan Xian dared. The faces of the Qin family generals beside the crown prince all revealed angry expressions. Qingyi! Fan Xian once again shouted explosively. It rose up in spirals and spread throughout the royal palace, shocking everyone's hearts. It also gathered the old Qin master's attention. Separated by a great distance, and under the gazes of tens of thousands of people, Fan Xian looked at where the old Qin master was and faintly said, You only have one son. Where is he? Qin Heng had entered through Xingyang Gate, and was the closest. The rebel army had already surrounded him, but he still had not arrived. The rebel army generals had long been secretly worried about this matter. Hearing Fan Xian's words, they couldn't help but feel their hearts jump. The old Qin master's eyes narrowed, but he did not have an overly shocked expression. After pausing for a moment, Fan Xian opened his mouth and said in a cold voice, You should have guessed something yourself. Correct, your eldest son was killed by my subordinate Jing Ge with a spear in the camp. Today, Qin Heng was killed by the Overwatch Council at Xingyang Gate. If you dare to betray the emperor, I can have your Qin family end without descendants. What malicious words. What a thorn that pierced straight into one's heart. In an instant, the battlefield once again sank into a suffocating silence. The great prince glanced at him and said in a low voice, "It doesn't seem to be a good choice for you to make the old man mad right now." Fan Xian's gaze was level as he stared at where Crown Prince Li Chengqian was. Faintly he said, "I just want to see if there will be any more problems between the old man and the Crown Prince when he is mad." The development of the situation did not continue according to Fan Xian's plan. After the old Qin master heard Fan Xian's malicious words, he only slowly lowered his head and then slowly raised it again. His old face wrapped in armor was completely indifferent. There was not a trace of change in emotion. "Fan Xian, let me thank you first for helping me resolve a question I've had for many years," the old Qin master said slowly. Old Master Qin said slowly, his voice spreading in all directions. "My eldest son was killed in the camp. That murderer should have died in prison. Later, when I checked the files, it was the same. But I never found the murderer's body. Now I know that it was taken away by that old black dog." The military elder slowly said, "I will leave your body intact. As for Chen Pingping, I will have him suffer 1,000 cuts. As for Qin Heng, I have always had confidence in this child. Even if you could stop him for a moment at Jingyang Gate, how could you do anything to him?" The old Qin master said coldly, "Even if he dies, so what? It is hard for a general to not die in battle. If he dies to your schemes, then he dies honorably. Die without descendants? I haven't even been afraid of that demoness of yours. Do you think you can anger this old man with just a few words?" Old Master Qin looked at the younger generation on top of the city wall with a mocking gaze and said word by word, "The old man has already gone mad. Let's see how long he can pretend for. When one is old and about to die, this kind of nonsense is especially abundant." Just like the old Qin master, Fan Xian finally learned of a secret he had guessed for a long time. He sighed in his heart and turned his gaze slightly, looking sincerely at the crown prince beside the old Qin master. He spoke before the crown prince could open his mouth, and with sincerity. "Chengqian, surrender." Sincerely saying, "Everyone, please give me your monthly tickets." Chapter 565. Chengqian, just surrender. Fan Xian's warm and gentle words made the tens of thousands of people inside and outside the royal palace dumbfounded at the same time. They felt it was incomparably absurd. The rebel army had surrounded the city. The people in the palace couldn't escape even if they wanted to. Sir Fan Jr. was shamelessly speaking on top of the palace walls at this moment to urge them to surrender. Crown Prince Li Chengqian, dressed in martial attire, sat on his horse. He sucked in a cold breath and thought to himself that Enji's skin was indeed becoming thicker and thicker to be able to say such things. Furthermore, he had said it so naturally. If someone who didn't know the situation had heard this, they would probably think that he, Li Chengqian, was the pitiful person being chased like a rabbit and not Fan Xian. In just one night, Fan Xian had changed from a court criminal to a so-called regent. He had shaken off his life of exile and broken into the royal palace. He had almost captured the crown prince in one move and successfully reversed the situation. Immediately after, in the early hours of the morning, the crown prince had luckily escaped. The army entered the city and instead surrounded Fan Xian in the palace. The so-called changing of the royal flag on top of the palace walls probably referred to the story of what had happened that night. The story had always been absurd. What was the point of Fan Xian saying such absurd words? Li Chengqian raised his head to look at his two brothers on top of the palace walls. After smiling bitterly, he shook his head and thought self-mockingly that after the old Qin master had spoken, he should have been the one to sincerely urge his brother to surrender. Unexpectedly, Fan Xian had rushed to say such words and stuffed his own words in his mouth. Fan Xian was indeed sinister to the extreme. The sound of messy horse hooves rang out from the square to the right. Li Chengqian unconsciously turned his head to look and saw the Dingzhou army entering the capital from the west gate, slowly moving toward the center of the army he was in. He furrowed his brows. In front of the thousands of people, he saw the second prince's handsome face. A faint chill rose in his heart. The things in his brother's heart were not simple. His face was very similar to Fan Xian's. The calculations in his heart were probably just as sinister. The Dingzhou army slowly stopped on the right flank of the rebel army and carefully maintained a respectful attitude toward the rebel camp. Big brother, you and I. Crown Prince Li Chengqian glanced at the second prince and finally opened his mouth. He could not wait for the second prince to speak. However, he did not have the support of internal qi. He had to shout to be heard by those on the palace walls. Although he still maintained the dignified royal aura that he had cultivated as the crown prince of the Eastern Palace for a dozen years, in comparison, it was not as valiant as when Fan Xian had berated the Qin family. Fan Xian picked his ear and glanced at the great prince. He didn't say anything, because the great prince was listening very seriously. The crown prince's words were all within his calculations. He was trying to use brotherly affection to convince the great prince. At the same time, he was still pushing the Dong Mountain incident onto Fan Xian. Although the crown prince knew that the great prince would not believe that Fan Xian was the assassin, he still had to say it. Any brotherly bond had to be built on a logical foundation. The great prince's expression darkened. The emperor had 5 sons. If one did not count Fan Xian, who had grown up in Danzhou, and the third prince, who was the last to be born, then he, the crown prince, and the second prince could be said to have grown up together. Although the crown prince's status was respected, the 3 brothers had a good relationship, particularly before the emperor showed favor to the second prince. The interactions between the 3 princes were more valuable than the bloody plots and stories in the history books. Everyone had thought, but no one wanted to imagine, that one day, these 3 brothers, who had grown up together, would meet with swords and weapons. The second prince, who had remained silent since the rebel army surrounded the palace, also opened his mouth. He gently used the heel of his boot to tap the horse beneath him, and allowed the horse to take him 10 feet out of the rebel army ranks. Gazing at the palace walls, he followed the crown prince's words, and began to speak sincerely to the great prince. It had to be said that the second prince did indeed have a way of winning people's hearts. He did not mention the matter of the great prince surrendering. He only used the friendship of the past to describe his displeasure at the great prince helping Fan Xian in an angry tone. He also faintly mentioned that the Qing emperor's attitude toward the great prince was not like that of a father toward his son. Fan Xian glanced at the great prince and found that beside him, the great prince's expression was growing darker and darker. He was not worried that the great prince would fall under the pressure of the situation and the crown prince and second prince's familial attacks. When he analyzed something, he would always start from a person's personality. He knew that the great prince's personality was like a raging fire. He turned to look at the still shouting second prince and furrowed his brows slightly. He recognized the general beside the second prince as Yi Zhong. 30 years ago, Yi Zhong was already the commander of the Jingdou garrison. Now he was in his 50s, but he did not look old at all. Furthermore, he did not have the imposing aura of other famous Qing generals. His figure was a little short and a little fat. However, Fan Xian would not underestimate him, because he knew that he was a 9th-level ace who had long made a name for himself. Yi Liuyun's closest nephew, who had once fought with his terrifying mother, was not a simple person. Furthermore, a person who could become the commander of the Jingdou garrison at the age of 20 could not be described as simple. Fan Xian's brows furrowed deeper and deeper, but his eyes grew brighter and brighter. They were as bright as a star that refused to retreat under the light of the rising sun. The great prince suddenly yelled loudly at the rebel soldiers below the palace walls. "Enough!" The second prince smiled helplessly and stopped talking. The great prince said in a severe voice, "What time is this? You still don't forget to frame Fan Xian. I know that for the sake of the throne, you are willing to do any ugly things. But don't forget, there are some things that I cannot do. If you want to attack, then attack. Don't be so long-winded like a woman." These words were said resolutely and with great vigor. They did not give the crown prince and second prince any room to maneuver. The second prince's usually gentle face finally became dark. For some reason he had become so angry. Angrily, he roared toward the palace walls, "Big brother! Don't forget, we are the brothers." Brothers? The great prince had been worried about the guards of the royal palace, and the major plan with Fan Xian for many days. His mind had been exhausted. His eyes were deeply sunk in, but they only made his gaze appear even sharper. He looked at the crown prince, and then at the second prince. Suddenly, in a severe voice, he said, "Brothers, you aren't even willing to be sons, yet you are willing to be brothers." There was a silence. These words had exposed too many things. The imperial soldiers on the palace walls had long known of this matter from the posthumous edict. Immediately, their eyes revealed grief, anger, and pain. However, the expressions of the rebel soldiers below the palace walls became strange. Although the emperor had been assassinated on Dong Mountain, the emperor's might still existed. As a disciple of the Qing army, he carried the crown prince's banner. In reality, what he was doing was killing the emperor and usurping the throne. Who would not be terrified? Who would not have their stomachs drumming? The great prince stood between the battlements of the palace walls and furrowed his brows deeply. Looking at the crown prince, he said sorrowfully, "The Dong Mountain incident was done by the eldest princess. I know you don't have this ability, but you must know, even if father wants to depose you, you are still a son. How could you do such a thing that is worse than an animal?" The crown prince's expression was dim. He maintained his silence and allowed the great prince to angrily rebuke him. The old Qin master furrowed his brows and waved his hand. The rebel soldiers behind him began to prepare to attack the palace. Gradually, the sound of bowstrings being pulled rang out from behind them. The teeth-numbing sound of bowstrings being pulled rang out, as the three princes fiercely discussed the dark secrets of the royal family, and were angry with each other. No one noticed that Fan Xian had already left the top of the palace walls by himself. Following the long stone steps down into the royal palace, he walked across the spacious square and headed toward Taiji Palace. Along the way, Fan Xian watched intently. He found that although the great prince was skilled in field battles on the grasslands, he was also very skilled in the defense of the palace. Preparations had been made everywhere. Beside the entrance of the stone steps, he had even taken down 2 corner towers of the royal palace and prepared stone and heavy wood. It looked like he was preparing to attack the palace later. At the side of the 3 palace gates below the imperial city, there were already some grotesquely shaped stones that even had moss on them. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and wondered if the fake mountains in the palace had also been taken down by the eldest prince. Just as he was thinking this, a group came in front of him. Under the escort of a few imperial soldiers, 100 or so tired-looking eunuchs were using carts to push the moss-covered stones. It was indeed the fake mountains in the palace. There were 3 palace doors in the royal palace. Usually, only one would be open. When the rebel soldiers attacked, they would not only choose one. Fan Xian knew that the great prince was preparing to use the fake mountains and stones to firmly block these 3 palace doors. This work had probably been prepared since before dawn, blocking the rebel soldiers outside the palace, and trapping himself inside the palace was what was called defending to the death. Fan Xian sighed. He knew that the eldest prince had already made up his mind to die. Compared to the spacious royal palace, there were not many imperial soldiers. Compared to the spacious royal palace, they were sparse. There was not much confidence. Fan Xian sighed again. He knew that the 1,000-odd imperial soldiers had already been moved to the palace square, where the eunuchs and serving girls lived. First, it was to suppress the restless factor in the palace. Second, it was because in the entire royal palace, that was the easiest place to break through. Entering Taiji Palace, he saw the worried officials, the heavy-faced Lady Ning and Yi Guipin, and the restless third prince. Fan Xian sighed 3 times in his heart. He bowed to the scholars Hu and Shu, but he piled a smile on his face and said to the third prince, "Qingping, the battle is about to start. Do you feel excited?" The third prince, Li Qingping, was after all a child. After learning that the royal palace was surrounded, he had begun to feel afraid. Although he forcefully suppressed it on his face, after hearing Fan Xian's words, he couldn't resist flattening his mouth. Amidst the fear, there was still a smile from Fan Xian's teasing. It appeared very comical. Fan Xian turned and bowed to the pale-faced Empress Dowager. He then glanced at the long-haired Empress and said in a low voice, I invite the Empress Dowager and Empress Dowager to come up to the palace walls to watch the battle. Since ancient times, rebellion had to be carried out. The work of clarifying righteousness and flaunting one's legitimacy had already ended amidst the great prince's angry rebuke and the crown prince and second prince's depression. The rebel soldiers at the foot of the palace walls were already closing in, particularly the thousands of archers in the rear barracks. They had begun to prepare to shoot in unison. There were only 1,000 imperial soldiers on the top of the palace walls. After this rain of arrows, there would probably be many casualties. The great prince's hand pressed against his sword and walked silently on the top of the palace walls. Occasionally, he gave a few orders, ordering the soldiers to prepare to welcome the rebel army's attack. This was the first time the Qing royal palace had been baptized by a rain of arrows. No one knew what kind of bloody rain and foul wind they could withstand after the rain of arrows. Because they had not planned to defend the royal palace and did not control the city guards, the imperial soldiers' defense was already at a disadvantage. They did not have enough bows and arrows in their hands. They could only rely on the 4 city-guarding crossbows at the 4 corners of the palace walls. However, there were tens of thousands of rebel soldiers. Even if these 4 crossbows were cannons used to kill mosquitoes, how many could they kill? Get ready! The great prince's hand gripped his sword tightly as he stared at the black mass of rebel soldiers below the palace walls. Hearing the endless sounds of bowstrings being pulled taut, his heart involuntarily tightened. Thousands of archers drew their bows at the same time. The heart-shaking creaking sound seemed to pierce through everyone's eardrums on the palace walls and shake through everyone's mind. The imperial soldiers on the palace walls had already hidden behind the arrow mounds. Soldiers holding shields were also waiting behind the great prince. A great battle was about to break out at any moment. Everyone was waiting for the moment the sky full of arrows whistled through the air. However, Fan Xian did not let all of this happen. He had no interest in admiring the sight of the siege. He also did not show off until the imperial soldiers had suffered heavy losses, and then bring out his good or bad hand. A flurry of hurried footsteps came from the stone steps. Following the footsteps was Fan Xian, and the dozens of panting old officials behind him. There were also a number of women half supported and half held by eunuchs. These women were originally the most honorable women in the world. Now they had become the most lowly and humiliating. Fan Xian held the third prince's hand with one hand and walked behind the great prince. Narrowing his eyes, he looked at the rebel army camp below the palace walls that was about to shoot. He couldn't help but feel shocked. With so many arrows shooting over, how could the royal palace be defended? He circulated his zhenqi and shouted loudly to the rebel soldiers below the palace walls. Chengqian, second prince, quickly stop. Hearing this, the crown prince and second prince raised their heads and looked toward the palace walls. They then saw a scene that made their hearts tremble. Mother! Mother! Empress Dowager! Looking at the women who had suddenly appeared on the palace walls, the crown prince and second prince couldn't help but cry out in surprise. Even the old Qin master and Yi Zhong couldn't help but furrow their brows. Then, they heard Fan Xian yell at them from beside the women. Don't fight in a hurry. I've brought your mother, grandmother, and brother to see you. Hearing these words, many people had the urge to vomit blood. No one would have thought that Fan Xian, who was renowned as an immortal poet and had displayed his dark power as the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, would say such shameless words. However, only Fan Xian knew that after experiencing the life and death experience on the meadow, his life had finally undergone a welcome change. He had shaken off the dark air accumulated from 2 lives and was gradually coming closer. Gradually, he was going to merge with the little boy on the rooftop in Danzhou, who had yelled for it to rain to collect his clothes. Such a Fan Xian was a cute Fan Xian, a disgusting Fan Xian, a shameless Fan Xian, and a terrifying Fan Xian. No matter how shrewd the crown prince and second prince were, seeing this frightening scene, they couldn't help but become angry. The second prince scolded in a stern voice. Fan Xian, you're shameless. Fan Xian glared back at him and scolded. You just realized? The crown prince was also incomparably angry, but he immediately said to the old Qin master beside him in a panic. Don't shoot. The old Qin master furrowed his brows, and thought that it was natural for these nobles in the palace to be used by Fan Xian to threaten him. Had the crown prince not thought of this? The old general sighed in his heart. The crown prince was kind, but the cowardice that had gradually disappeared these 2 years had finally surfaced. For a soldier, in this moment of life and death, there should be no hesitation. The so-called fear of shooting at the rat for fear of harming the innocent was just cowardice. In the end, the old Qin master did not understand that sometimes another name for cowardice was human nature. Without question, Fan Xian's behavior right now did not have much of a human nature. He had only calculated the crown prince's personality. Calmly smiling, he stood by the great prince's side and said, "I just don't want to be shot into a porcupine. Why did you bring Qingping here? He is still a child." The great prince sighed and looked at the officials beside him, the Empress Dowager and Lady Shu. He then glanced at the third prince and spoke with disapproval. "As the future monarch of Qing Kingdom, I must see this scene with my own eyes." Fan Xian gently held the third prince's trembling hands. The third prince had seen so many rebel soldiers with his own eyes. He had truly been frightened. Fan Xian smiled slightly at the trusted aide beside him and ordered, "Please have Lady Shu stand in the left corner tower. Please have the Empress stand in the right corner tower. Please." He glanced at the pale-faced but silent Empress Dowager and said, "Please have the Empress Dowager stand by my side. I'll put 3 master cards here. I want to see if their arrows are as accurate." Hearing these words, the people on the palace walls all felt a chill in their hearts. After the clamor, Fan Xian looked at the people in the rebel army camp, who were arguing fiercely about something and said, "Regardless of what the crown prince and the old Qin master decide to compromise in the end, presumably they will both be very displeased with each other." The great prince sucked in a cold breath and looked at him. "You even calculated this?" Fan Xian turned his head and glanced at the cold-faced second prince, and the short tower, like Yi Zhong beside him. "There are still many things I am calculating. If the one leading today was the second prince, the rain of arrows would probably have arrived by now. Although the Empress is not as amiable as Lady Shu, her fate is much better than Lady Shu's because her son is stronger than Lady Shu's son. Even if they don't shoot, the rebel army will still attack." Fan Xian lowered his head slightly. "Go and prepare. I need to think through a problem." The great prince glanced at him and ordered his trusted aide to heavily protect the third prince. He then glanced at the silent Empress Dowager. Confusion grew in his heart, but it was not convenient for him to say more. He left. Fan Xian let go of the third prince's hand and held the Empress Dowager's old and slightly stiff hand. He took a few steps to the left like a filial grandson holding his grandmother. He allowed the Empress Dowager, dressed in a bright yellow phoenix robe, to appear on top of the palace walls. She was like a bright lamp hanging high in the morning sky, reflected in the eyes of all the rebel soldiers. The archers of the rebel army unconsciously loosened their bowstrings. Although the orders from their superiors had not yet come, their arms were already beginning to ache. Furthermore, everyone had guessed who the old woman in phoenix robe was. She was the emperor's mother, the crown prince's grandmother, and the only remaining elder of the Qing royal family. Even talking about such a noble figure was a blasphemy, much less pointing an arrow at her. If they accidentally injured the Empress Dowager, who would bear the consequences? As long as it was a Qing citizen, no one wanted the Empress Dowager to suffer any harm. Thus, when Fan Xian brought the Empress Dowager onto the palace walls, the great prince's mood was awkward. After the scholars Shu, and who did not listen to their advice, they could only sigh. Those who knew the details of the palace rebellion last night all knew that Fan Xian never used the most sinister methods to deal with the noblest of people. The sword mark on the Empress Dowager's neck was the most powerful evidence. Fan Xian gently helped the Empress Dowager tidy the high collar of her phoenix robe, and carefully pulled out a strand of hair. Evenly he said, "As expected, Empress Dowager still has to wear formal attire. Only then will it have sufficient intimidation power. It was not in vain that I wasted my time ordering those old nannies to dress you up." The Empress Dowager suddenly turned her head. Boundless hatred abruptly appeared in her old and tired eyes. It was as if she wanted to swallow Fan Xian. Fan Xian didn't even look at her gaze. By her ear he quietly said, I also know that it is very painful not being able to speak. Taking my medicine is also very painful. Think about it. Your Li family deserves this kind of retribution. I am punishing you on behalf of my mother. We have our own club on the front page of the website, the Qingyu Year Cat Fan. If everyone is interested, you can go in and take a look. There are many interesting comments and tidbits. I personally liked the chapter today. If you also liked it, please give me a monthly reward. There are too many strong books this month. The pressure of getting a reward is too great. P.S. I have some personal matters to take care of in the next 2 days, so I will write less. I sincerely wish everyone a happy weekend. Chapter 566. It was sweet and sour. It was the taste of the pill Fan Xian had forced the Empress Dowager to swallow. The pill had always been kept close to Fan Xian's body. Even though he had experienced so many life and death battles these 2 years, entered the sea and climbed mountains, and was covered in wounds, Fan Xian did not lose these pills. He knew these pills were very important to him. It had been a dozen years ago in Danzhou when Fan Xian's teacher, Fei Jia, had solemnly stuffed the medicinal pouch into his small hands. He was afraid that the tyrannical Jinqi Fan Xian practiced would explode and cause him to die a tragic death. However, in these dozen years, Fan Xian had never taken this medicine. After killing Xia Bayan by the second prince's side in the Jingdou government and fighting the shadow head-on, his Jinqi finally exploded in his body, and he became a cripple. Even under these circumstances, he did not take the medicine. He knew how tyrannical this medicine was. It was a medicine that scattered martial arts. Fan Xian was unwilling to disperse all the cultivation in his body, so he endured the pain of his meridians being torn and the stiffness of being unable to move. He persisted in not taking the medicine Sir Fei Jia had left behind. Fortunately, Haidang had later secretly brought the heart of Tianyi Dao to Jiangnan. Only then could his strange injuries slowly heal. Now, he had finally delivered this pill into the Empress Dowager's mouth. The medicinal properties of this pill were strong. It followed the path of scattering martial arts and gathering qi. It entered one's internal organs with unusual directness and gradually annihilated the body's vitality. It had to be said that if Fan Xian did not have the heart of Tianyi Dao, once his Jinqi exploded, he could only use this pill to disperse the overly violent tyrannical Jinqi and exuberant vitality in his body. However, the Empress Dowager was already old and weak. She did not have many years left to live. Taking this pill at this time was equivalent to the remnants of life in her body being gradually pulled out of her body by the medicine, speeding up the path of death. Her life gradually dimmed. Her old body could not withstand it and was already at its weakest point. Fan Xian had a great fear, so he did not brazenly use poison on the Empress Dowager. However, the medicine Fei Jia had left behind was not poison. No matter which famous doctor in the world came to diagnose, they would not be able to find anything strange. The Empress Dowager no longer had the strength to speak. Soon she felt the burden on her body grow heavier and heavier. Even if she wanted to raise her arm, she couldn't do it. Unless another great grandmaster appeared in the world and forcefully used extremely pure Jinqi to help her reflect for an instant, the Empress Dowager could only miserably become a cripple who couldn't speak or move. Then, she would slowly wait for death to come. It was not that Fan Xian was ruthless. It was not that Fan Xian's desire for revenge had burned away his rationality like wildfire. In the current situation, and with Fan Xian's great hidden worry, he could only use this method to ensure his present and future safety. Right now the rebel army was surrounding the city. The Empress Dowager could be the god's card to weaken the rebel army's attack. But what about the safety in the future? The Empress Dowager did not know how sinister and vicious the medicine she had taken contained. She only thought it was a mute medicine. She still looked at Fan Xian with hatred. Fan Xian did not meet the Empress Dowager's dim and angry gaze. Instead, he turned his cold gaze toward the 2 powers high above the palace walls. He looked seriously at Yi Zhong beside the second prince and the short and strong general. A strange light shone through his eyes. It was as if he was thinking endlessly about something. The Dingzhou army had not entered the capital to present prisoners of war. As usual, there were only a few thousand soldiers. However, Yi Zhong and the second prince had led tens of thousands of people into Jingdou. It looked like they had long been prepared. However, he did not find Hongqing's figure among the rebel army. This made Fan Xian feel a glimmer of relief. Looking from a distance, the rebel army leaders seemed to be arguing about something. The crown prince remained silent. He used his worried eyes to watch the movements on the palace walls. He was worried about his mother and grandmother's safety. In his heart, he cursed Fan Xian, the great prince Hu Shu, and the other old officials viciously. Fan Xian suddenly narrowed his eyes. He saw that the rebel army leaders had stopped their discussion. The sound of horse hooves gradually rang out. The Qin and Yi families each split up their troops and pressed toward the two flanks. He abruptly turned his head and glanced at the great prince not far away. The great prince nodded at him to indicate that he had long been prepared. Only then did he relax. It looked like the main direction of the rebel army's attack, other than the main gate of the royal palace, had chosen Taiping Square. The palace walls there were slightly shorter. Furthermore, it was a place where eunuchs and serving girls lived, so the entrance was never strictly guarded. The great prince had long predicted this. He had moved a large number of soldiers forward to guard it. He had also moved over 70 to 80% of the loyal generals he had raised from the Western Expedition Army. It was just petty cleverness. It was only to stall for time. He still hadn't caught the one that had escaped and could change the situation. Fan Xian's mind suddenly began to empty again. His eyes gazed at the densely packed rebel army below the palace walls. It was as if he had seen through their existence. He gazed at a place further away, at the past, and at the variable he had been waiting for but had never appeared. 30,000 against a few thousand. No matter how high the palace walls were, even if the rebel army didn't dare to release arrows, and even if they had to use people to fill in the gaps, they had to fill in the moat outside the royal palace. They had to fill in a human ladder, climb to a high place, and destroy everything in the royal palace. Looking at the busy arrangements of the rebel army and the gradually rising siege ladders, Fan Xian's pupils constricted slightly. He felt a glimmer of coldness at the bottom of his heart. The three-part ladder produced by the third workshop of the palace treasury had finally been moved over. The attack was finally about to begin. These military equipment were all produced by the palace treasury. As the head of the palace treasury, Fan Xian couldn't help but feel a glimmer of absurdity. The things he had produced were going to be used to attack him, and he couldn't find any way to deal with it. His heart began to beat faster. His scalp felt numb. His brows were furrowed tightly. Suddenly, he took a few heavy breaths. He felt that there was a problem with his breathing. His chest felt heavy. Leaning against the arrow hole made of bricks, he slowly crouched down. The hearts of everyone on the palace walls jumped. They all rushed in his direction. The battle was imminent. If one of the main commanders, Fan Xian, suddenly had a problem with his body, it would, without a doubt, be a massive blow to the morale of the imperial army. The third prince was close to him. Fearfully holding his left arm, he called out, "Sir, what is it?" Without waiting for more people to gather around him, Fan Xian raised his right arm with his head down. In a tired voice he said, "I need a quiet place to think about some problems. You all go prepare. Don't mind me." Hearing this, no one could relax. Seeing his stubbornness and the fact that the rebel army was already preparing to attack, they could only accept their orders and rush to the area they were defending. The great prince stood in the commander's position and glanced at him from a distance. Seeing Fan Xian, who had been full of killing intent earlier, now crouching helplessly at the foot of the palace walls, he couldn't help but feel his heart dim. "Who the scholar? I'll have to trouble you to buy some time." Fan Xian lowered his head and spoke in a quiet voice. Who the scholar glanced at him with concern and sighed. He walked to the side of the palace walls and spoke in a loud voice. The third prince anxiously stood guard by his side. He didn't know how Fan Xian was right now. Fan Xian simply sat down on the foot of the palace walls and buried his head deeply between his legs. Breathing with difficulty, he looked very pitiful. He was like a homeless cat on a rainy night. Faintly, who the scholar's righteous and awe-inspiring words reached his ears. It seemed that he was carrying out his final conversation with the crown prince. Although these words floated into Fan Xian's ears, he was not able to hear a single word clearly. However, he had confidence in who the scholar. Since he was buying time, he had to buy it for a while. The problem Fan Xian faced was the chaos in his mind. After returning to the capital from Dong Mountain, he had done things step by step. In his confrontation with the eldest princess, there had been victories and defeats. Even when he was trapped in the royal palace, he was still full of confidence. The details of many events gave him a faint hint. The eldest princess and crown prince's rebellion had long been calculated by Chen Pingping. Since it was so, when things progressed to the final moment, there would always be a chance to turn the tables. Just as he had thought in the early hours of the morning, there would always be someone coming to save him on colorful auspicious clouds. However, the morning clouds had already dispersed, and the red light was no longer there. Where was the person who would come to save him? A heavy sniper rifle? No, if he hadn't thought through this matter clearly, Fan Xian would not use this trump card. There was a problem. Fan Xian closed his eyes tightly. As he coughed, he quickly turned his head. In the end, he still could not grasp the important point that had flashed through his mind like a goose. He had used up too much of his mind and energy. Fan Xian's coughing grew more and more severe. He slowly opened his eyes. His eyes were completely blood red. After being injured by Yin Xiaoyi, forcing his way into the capital, forcefully breaking into the palace, and laughing and talking without fear on the royal palace, he had already used up all of his energy. He was only relying on the Third Bureau's secret ephedra pills to forcefully stimulate his mind. Fan Xian took a few heavy breaths. Using trembling hands, he took out 2 pungent ephedra pills from his clothes and brought them to his lips. He carelessly chewed a few times and swallowed them. He knew that this medicine was very damaging to the body. In such a dangerous situation, even if he had to drink doves to quench his thirst, he could only gladly endure it. Although Li Qingping didn't know what his teacher was eating, he, who had been concerned about him the entire time, had already guessed that Fan Xian's body had reached the end of its life. His blood-red eyes represented an inauspicious omen. Involuntarily, he nervously and unhappily gripped Fan Xian's hands on his knees. The medicine took effect quickly. Fan Xian's chest felt much more comfortable. It was as if each breath he took in was many times more air than usual. Naturally, his coughing also slowed. However, the lines of blood in his eyes grew denser. Compared to his slightly haggard but full of heroic spirit, he appeared to have a heart-palpitating charm. With a slap, Fan Xian, who was sitting on the ground, suddenly pulled his hand out of Li Qingping's small hands. Like lightning, he reached to the left and grabbed the old woman's feet in the golden palace shoes. Fan Xian didn't turn his head to look. He only coldly said, "You didn't dare to kill yourself in the palace. Now you want to use your death to provoke the crown prince into a fierce attack?" When he stretched out his hand like lightning, the pair of feet in the palace shoes were trying to quietly stand on their tiptoes and move their owner's weak body toward the hard ground below the palace walls. Li Qingping looked at this scene with great terror. He watched as the Empress Dowager's feet were forcefully pressed down by Fan Xian the moment before she jumped off the wall to kill herself. The Empress Dowager had taken the medicine and was already at the end of her life. Fan Xian had not recovered from his heavy injuries. Forcefully increasing his power, he was also almost at the end of his life. However, a murderous aura of death still echoed between these two grandmother and grandson, who were both at the end of their lives. It was always simple for a person to die. The Empress Dowager looked coldly and hatefully at the side of Fan Xian's face. Seeing the strange redness seeping out of his eyes, she gradually felt pleasure in her heart. No matter how powerful the wicked woman and her son were, in the end, they could not be allowed to exist in this world. This was something that had long been decided by fate. History had long proven this point. However, after Fan Xian said those words, he unexpectedly sank into silence. His eyes stared blankly ahead and gradually furrowed his brows. His eyes gradually lit up, just like when he was looking at Yi Zhong earlier. It was as if he had finally thought through something and made up his mind about something. The negotiations between the scholar and the crown prince had already broken down. The rebel army beat the war drums and began their first attack on the city. Far behind them, in the area of Taiping Square to the left, a heaven-shaking cry of killing rang out. The war drums rang out. Although there was no rain of arrows, there were stray arrows flying through the sky with a whistling sound. Countless rebel soldiers pushed ladders and large carriages covered in oilcloth. Bravely, they braved the giant crossbows and sporadic rain of arrows. Against the rocks falling from the top of the palace walls, they charged forward. In an instant, the foot of the palace walls was filled with wretched cries. The sight of blood flowing and the pain of fire burning filled the air. The morning sun had long risen into the slanting sky. Mercilessly, it watched Jingdo bleed again after a dozen years. Fan Xian slowly rose and emotionlessly watched the scene in front of him. He didn't look at the Empress Dowager beside him. Instead, he said to her, "I've thought through many things." When he pressed down on the Empress Dowager's foot, he couldn't help but think of his grandmother in Danzhou. He thought of the words she had always sternly told him. The Fan family does not need to take sides because we will always stand on the emperor's side. Chapter 567. The stray arrows whistled through the sky, but it was more of a deterrent. Under the crown prince's powerful suppression, the rebel army did not have the courage to rain down a terrifying rain of arrows on the city walls. Thus, the pressure the imperial army guarding the royal palace faced immediately lessened. They only had to face the problem of contact. Although the sounds of killing shook the heavens below the royal palace, it did not cause any losses to the imperial army. Instead, it was the imperial army stationed in the direction of Taiping Square that faced the greatest danger. However, there were many rebel soldiers at the main gate of the royal palace. At this moment, the thousands of rebel soldiers below the city walls had split into 3 rows and formed 3 black lines that pressed forward. It was truly frightening. Muffled sounds continuously rang out from the 4 corner towers of the imperial city. Every sound would tug at the heartstrings of the crowd, and the entire imperial city would tremble. The strong vibrations represented the strength of the city guarding crossbow. The giant crossbow bolts pierced through the air like black light and mercilessly stabbed into the rebel army's formation. Countless bursts of blood blossomed, and the ground was covered in sticky meat paste. However, there were only 4 city guarding crossbows, and there were only 2 on the left and right side of the square. How many people could they kill? The rebel army's triple wave charged quickly to the foot of the royal palace without any obstruction. The main target of the city guarding crossbows was still the military equipment the rebel army used to attack the city, especially the sharp and heavy carriages used to break through the thick palace gates. These carriages had fire blades made from cowhide, and the front end was a giant piece of wood that had been sharpened into a sharp point. They were already very heavy. Once they were pushed at high speed, the impact against the palace gates was very powerful. A crossbow bolt accurately struck a battering ram. The sharp tip easily tore through the seemingly tough cowhide and slammed heavily into the ram. Although the ram was tough and could not be broken by a giant crossbow bolt, the powerful impact of the city guarding crossbow still caused the ram to jump up. It was like a beetle on the ground that felt the earth shake. Then it rolled over miserably and crushed a number of rebel soldiers beside it to death. It could no longer move. Within the 3 rows of rebel army charging formation were a dozen heavy and murderous rams. The moment the attack began, the 2 city guarding crossbows fired with all their might and successfully destroyed 3 of the rams. However, the city guarding crossbows took too long to reload, and the rebel army's charge came very quickly. In an instant, most of the rams had passed the line of fire of the city guarding crossbows and neared the 3 main gates of the royal palace. The rebel soldiers shouted in unison, pushing the battering ram as they charged forward with all their might. With a number of teeth-numbing sounds, the rams finally successfully crashed into the thick palace gates. The main gates of the Qing royal palace were very thick. Under such a terrifying crash, they still shook violently. The hinges of the door creaked, as if they were about to fall apart. The 4 giant door bolts, which were arranged from top to bottom, were bent out of shape. However, the thick door latch finally withstood this powerful impact, and the creaking sound of the door hinge gradually calmed down. Other than a large dent in the main door of the imperial palace, and a dozen or so copper nails falling, everything else was fine. At least in this attack, the main gates of the Qing royal palace still appeared sturdy and unbreakable. However, the rebel soldiers did not have a trace of a strange expression. Under the stern yells of their superiors, they quickly pulled the first wave of rams away from the palace gates. The rams in the second wave had already passed through the sparse arrows of the imperial soldiers on the city walls. They had escaped the powerful city-guarding crossbows that, like old people, only moved once in a while, and crashed viciously into the palace gates. There was another loud crash. This time, the palace gates had finally received an irreparable damage. The entire gate began to tremble. It gave one a feeling that it was on the verge of collapse. It was as if it could collapse at any moment. The elites of the imperial army, who were on standby behind the palace gates, led their horses and watched this scene calmly. Although their faces were calm, the anxiety that flashed across their eyes revealed their true feelings. Separated by a thick door, the rebel soldiers, risking their lives to launch a powerful attack, saw hope that the royal palace would be broken. Their morale immediately rose. With a loud roar, they charged forward again. The third wave of attacking troops arrived. Under the merciless attacks of the imperial army's arrows, boulders, and logs, the rebel army left behind hundreds of corpses. Finally, they succeeded in withstanding the third wave of attacks on the palace gates. With a muffled crack, dust flew into the air. It was like a paper bag filled with smoke had been smashed open by a naughty child's naughty palms. The dust settled slightly, and the field of view became slightly more peaceful. The countless rebel soldiers in the square saw that the thick and heavy palace gates in the middle of the royal palace had been smashed open. They couldn't help but cheer in unison. However, the group of elites closest to the imperial city didn't even have time to release any cheers. Even the excitement and joy on their faces were immediately replaced by shock and anger. They could clearly see that even though a large hole had been smashed open in the palace gate, revealing the thick wooden stubble inside, the entire palace gate showed no signs of collapsing. The ground was covered in golden copper nails. Behind the hole was a thick layer of stone and dirt. There was not a single gap to be seen. The people in the royal palace had blocked the palace gates. Did they not think of leaving a way out for themselves? At this moment, what was the difference between the royal palace and a large tomb? A rebel army officer roared wildly and led the attacking soldiers beside him into the hole. Although there wasn't much space, even if they had to dig open this palace gate. Military orders were like mountains. The Qing soldiers were never cowards who feared death on the battlefield. A long black spear pierced out like lightning from the only gap above the stone and dirt. It pierced the officer's throat, and fresh blood sprayed out. Below the royal palace, 10 paces behind the piles of fake mountains and broken stones in the long palace gates, 300 imperial soldiers calmly and nervously watched for any movement in the palace gates. Their commander had already led a small group in. At this moment, they had the advantage of the terrain. There was no reason for the rebel soldiers to attack so easily. Above the royal palace, the great prince watched coldly as the rebel soldiers' attacks grew stronger and stronger. He raised his right arm and brought it down viciously. The soldiers at his side accepted the order and quickly waved the yellow flag in their hands. Along the line in front of the royal palace, the hundreds of imperial soldiers on the palace walls moved at the same time. They lifted the sack at their feet and carefully tore it open. They then scattered it toward the heads of the rebel soldiers, who were no longer within the range of the crossbows. The slightly yellow powder was like dirty snow as it scattered down. In an instant, it enveloped the thousands of rebel soldiers closest to the royal palace. The rebel general paled in shock. He thought it was poison from the Overwatch Council and ordered his subordinates to be careful. It was not poison powder. The third bureau was not Fan Xian's tofu shop. They did not have the ability to produce so much poison. This yellow powder was all crude gunpowder that Fan Xian had ordered taken from the bottom floor of the square building before the imperial soldiers entered the palace in the early hours of the morning. The royal palace had never made preparations to welcome a powerful military attack, so there was no hot oil or anything that could be burned. If it were not for the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, Fan Xian, standing on their side, the battle to defend the city would probably have progressed unusually miserably. The great prince glanced at Fan Xian, who had been calmly watching the rebel army camp in the distance, and gently nodded his head. Fire! The face of the trusted officer, who had been following the great prince, was full of ruthlessness. He gave the order in a loud voice to all of the imperial soldiers on the royal palace walls. The previously sparse rain of arrows on the royal palace walls suddenly exploded with the most concentrated rain of arrows since the start of the battle. Furthermore, these arrows all carried a red light. It was like the inauspicious color that Qin Heng's valiant general saw before he died under Xingyang Gate. The fire arrows arrived below the walls in an instant. They did not need to be precise. They only needed to shoot into the powder. The sky was beautiful. The autumn sun had risen, and the weather was gradually warming up. The morning wind had already left. The powder that had been scattered down was not blown away by the wind, nor was it blown back up the walls as Fan Xian had been worried about. Instead, it formed a large patch of fog that enveloped the thousands of rebel soldiers below the walls. Looking at the beautiful morning scenery of the willow trees by the river bank, one could only see the vague figures inside that were beginning to panic. The fire arrows entered the fog. In an instant, they began to burn at a terrifying speed. Countless flames burned vigorously and quickly connected to form a large sea of fire. It was like a fire dragon lying below the royal palace. It was also like a calm lake illuminated by the golden sun. Gradually, waves began to rise and churn. It was extremely bright and scorching hot. It actually covered the light of the sun in the sky. What about the people in the fog? They howled wretchedly and burned, turning into countless pitiful people on fire. They desperately tried to run out of the fog. However, how could such a large area of burning be endured by normal creatures? Countless people on fire ran wildly on the square. Their wretched cries rose into the sky. The scene appeared unusually terrifying. Not a single burning rebel soldier was able to run back to their camp. Most of them had become charred corpses below the palace walls. Some of the burning people on fire only had time to run to the square before falling to the ground with a splat. With the remaining flames and rising smoke on their bodies, they twitched endlessly. Such a scene was extremely tragic. The rebel army camp in front of the buildings in the distance was in a state of panic. Even the Qing army, famed for its strict military discipline, felt fear at this moment. No one had thought that the imperial soldiers guarding the city would have such a terrifying method. The crown prince's face was ashen while the old Qin master looked coldly at the palace walls. Slowly he said, "Only Fan Xian could do such a ruthless method." The smell of burning in the square stimulated everyone's state of mind. Even the imperial soldiers on the palace walls felt a glimmer of fear and helplessness. Looking at the terrifying scene below, some people's lips turned white. They wondered if those charred corpses had all been killed by them. After such a destructive attack, the first wave of rebel soldiers who entered the palace returned dispiritedly. However, there were not many people who returned. The royal palace was finally held by a hair's breadth. However, the rebel army did not carry out a second round of attacks. It was clear that regardless of whether it was the defenders or the attackers, they had all been shocked by this unusually bloody and terrifying fog of fire. They all needed some time to digest and stabilize their morale. However, the instigator of this terrifying fire attack, Fan Xian's expression was unusually calm. He looked at the rebel army camp in the distance and pressed his lips together without saying a word. The great prince saw that Fan Xian's right hand, which was hanging by his sleeve, was trembling slightly. The veins in his eyes were becoming denser and denser. The great prince had not thought that the Overwatch Council's gunpowder powder would have such a terrifying effect. Looking at the scene in front of him, he, who had long experienced the blood and fire of the battlefields of the western region, did not feel any emotions that he should not have. However, he still felt shocked. If this powder could be used like this, what kind of changes would occur in future battles? Today is luck. Fan Xian did not turn his head to look at him. Quietly he said, "There is no wind or rain today. That is why there is such a good effect." Then he slowly lowered his head. Ever since he had taken control of the palace treasury, he had always been very attentive to the joint research work of the third workshop and the third bureau. In the depths of his heart, he understood why his mother, Yi Qingmei, had put so much effort into other military equipment and people's lives, but had strictly forbidden the use of gunpowder in this world. Even when he had saved Xiaoyin and Shangjing, the Overwatch Council had only provided 1 cart of gunpowder. The use of gunpowder in this world was still very clumsy. It was even worse than the self-made firecrackers in his previous life. In this world, only Fan Xian knew that even wood shavings flying through the air could cause a large explosion, much less gunpowder powder. Fan Xian couldn't help but worry whether the scene today would open Pandora's box for this land. After a moment he immediately felt relieved. The palace treasury's steel craftsmanship was not up to standard. There was no need to worry about the arrival of the era of firearms. Furthermore, just as he had said to the Great Prince, the main reason why the fire protecting the city had such a large effect was because the heavens were on their side. His luck was as strong as before. As for the wretched scene in front of him, Fan Xian actually felt his heart palpitate. Since he was young, he had seen countless corpses and had personally killed countless people. But when he personally saw so many charred corpses appear in front of him, he still felt waves of the urge to vomit. This was a battlefield, a true battlefield. It was precisely because of this that Fan Xian was even more determined to win. If a person came to this world with some kind of mission, he believed that his mission was the agreement with Haitang. If he wanted to reach that agreement, he had to survive today. Using a knife to kill was still killing. Using a gun to kill was still killing. Using gunpowder to burn people to death was also killing. Other than being a bit more terrifying and ugly, there was not much difference. After all, the rebellion this time belonged to a civil war. The two sides fighting were the elite troops of the Qin kingdom. The scene just now made too many people feel a chill in their hearts. The rebel soldiers returned to their camps to lick their wounds, preparing to once again carry the resentment of revenge and begin an even more powerful attack. The expressions on the faces of the imperial soldiers on the city walls were complicated. Many of them didn't even dare to look at the black-clothed Sir Fan Jr., standing coldly on the city walls. The smell of burning and the remnants of fire were still burning in front of the royal palace. The vermilion palace walls and the green bricks on top of the walls were all burned with streaks of color. It looked like this beautiful and solemn royal palace had been ruthlessly slashed with countless scars by a knife. The great prince looked at the scene in front of him and slowly swept his gaze over the imperial soldiers on the city walls. In a steady and firm voice he said to all sides, "This is war. Remember, those below the walls are rebels. If we allow them to break into the royal palace, the Qin court will descend into darkness. The people will never have a chance to rise again. You will all be crushed to pieces." "What is below the walls?" "It's the enemy," the great prince shouted in a stern voice. "You are all soldiers who have followed me back from the west. Why have we worked so hard to fight the Hu people on the grasslands? Everything is for the Qin kingdom. Those enemies want to destroy the foundation of the Qin kingdom. They are no different from the barbaric Hu people. They are just beasts. I order you from this moment on, you must treat these rebel soldiers as Hu people. Everything is for the Qin kingdom. The emperor is watching you from above." These were not hot-blooded words, but coming from the commander's mouth, they had a surprising effect of comforting people's hearts. The eyes of the imperial soldiers on the city walls gradually lit up, no longer as dim and lost as they had been earlier. For the Qin kingdom, everyone on the palace walls cried out. Even the third prince, who was standing by Fan Xian's side, was no exception. Only the Empress Dowager, who had been firmly restrained by Fan Xian, had a glimmer of mockery and panic flash through her eyes. A wave of heavy footsteps rang out on the city walls. A group of eunuchs, under the watch of Overwatch Council officials, carried 3 black coffins with difficulty to the top of the city walls. The coffins landed heavily on the city walls and made a few muffled thuds. Everyone looked at the 3 coffins in astonishment. Fan Xian gently held the third prince's hand and stood behind the great prince. To the imperial soldiers, officials, and Overwatch Council subordinates around him, he quietly said, "We are the Emperor's officials. We have received the Emperor's posthumous edict to stop those rebellious plots. Regardless of whether we succeed or fail, we will not retreat a single step." The great prince's expression was solemn. He continued Fan Xian's words and said, "There are 3 coffins here. Qingping, Enji, and I will each have one. If the royal palace is broken into, the 3 of us will die here. This can be considered filial piety to father and loyalty to the Qing kingdom." He glanced at everyone and then slowly said, "Defend the palace to the death. Does everyone have confidence?" Even the cliched method of carrying coffins to battle had been brought out by Fan Xian. How could the soldiers not feel their blood boil? In unison they cried out, "Yes." Fan Xian held Li Qingping's hand and said in an even voice, "Are you afraid?" The third prince thought for a bit and shook his head forcefully. "No, father's son will not be afraid." "All right." Fan Xian glanced at him with a slight smile and didn't say anything more. He only thought that if the change did not happen and the royal palace was actually broken, he could only take the third prince and flee to the ends of the world. He could only hope that this kid wouldn't scold him when the time came. In the distance, the rebel soldiers began to gather again. The morale that had been suppressed by Fan Xian's evil plan seemed to have successfully turned into resentment toward the royal palace. Most of the Qing kingdom's troops had been on the battlefield for a long time. Their ability to mobilize soldiers was not inferior to anyone else's. The gazes of the rebel soldiers toward the royal palace began to fill with naked murderous intent. The sea of fire appeared terrifying, but in reality, it did not cause much damage to the rebel soldiers. Fan Xian looked at the scene in front of him and couldn't help his heart tremble slightly. He thought to himself that if he had calculated wrong, the following steps would probably kill many people on his side. He knew that he was completely unfamiliar with military affairs. So from beginning to end, he had not made any suggestions about the great prince's arrangement of troops. Instead, he calmly acted as a spectator and helper. At this moment, he was going to make an unusually daring suggestion. "How many imperial soldiers do we have left?" 2,700. "Basically, we haven't lost much." Fan Xian tilted his head and listened as the sounds of fighting in Taiping Square grew quieter. He furrowed his brows slightly and said, "Do you think we can hold it?" The great prince's sword-like brows were smeared with a layer of murderous intent. Straightforwardly, he said, "Even if father personally led troops, we wouldn't be able to hold it." A glimmer of self-mockery suddenly flashed through the corners of his lips. "The disparity between us and the enemy is too great. If the Western Expedition Army had not been disbanded by father, if I led, no, even if I only led 1/3 of the Western Expedition Army, I would still dare to fight a decisive battle against the rebel soldiers below." The great prince took a deep breath. "However, don't worry. Even if we lose, we won't lose so badly. The generals and soldiers under my command have all eaten Hu people's meat and drank Hu people's blood on the grasslands. The Qin family, It has been 20 years since the old man personally led troops. The soldiers of the Jingdou garrison are extremely lazy. The only one is the Dingzhou army." Fan Xian cut him off and said, "In that round of attack and defense just now, I noticed a problem." "What problem?" Fan Xian moved closer to the great prince's ear and quietly said a few words. "What are you thinking about?" A cold light flashed through the great prince's eyes. "I'm thinking about gambling." Fan Xian lowered his head and faintly said, "We no longer have any trump cards in our hands. If we continue like this, we will eventually die." The great prince furrowed his brows and said, "War is not child's play. What you're saying is too absurd." Fan Xian smiled bitterly. "It is indeed absurd. However, I truly can't think of any opportunity to turn the tables." He turned his head and glanced at the 3 coffins glowing with black light. His gaze gradually became determined. He still had a trump card, but he had not seen everyone's trump card clearly. No matter what, he would not use it. The great prince was silent for a moment and then suddenly said, "How do you want to gamble?" Dig up the rocks at the palace gates. Fan Xian raised his face and looked through the slightly warm air of the square at the commander of the Dingzhou army, Yi Zhong, who was quietly saying something to the second prince. His gaze narrowed slightly. We should be prepared to charge out at any moment and give ourselves a chance. He then smiled warmly and said, Give the world a surprise. Coincidentally, Yi Zhong, who was in the middle of a secret discussion with the second prince, seemed to feel the gaze from the palace walls. He raised his head and glanced back with unusual calmness and coldness. Ahem, when the great prince said this is war, I almost couldn't resist writing that all is fair in war. Everyone should know that I am the worst at writing these things. When I first conceived of Qing Yu's year, I made a great wish that I would try to learn and improve my abilities in this area. I am still not very good, but please see my progress and hard work. P.S. I don't know who wrote the KFC's Qing Yu's year review in the book review section. I just thought it was very funny. I don't know if that book friend knows me in real life, but most of his spoilers are definitely wrong. I was mad and changed the wrong words 3 times. It is now 6:08. To the friends who subscribed earlier, I apologize. Recently there have been too many wrong words. No matter how mad I am, this is the 4th time I've changed the wrong words. I've actually changed them before, but there are still so many. This is 6:09. Sorry. Chapter 568. There was a faint smoke all around, a thick stench of blood, and a faint terrifying smell of something burnt. The entire capital was in chaos. Other than the left and right of the royal palace, no one knew where else there was killing and strangling. The faint sounds of killing did not stop for a moment. The second prince furrowed his brows and stared in a daze at the blurry scene on the palace walls. Lowering his voice, he said, They won't be able to hold it. It's just a matter of how long they can last. All of the messengers my aunt arranged around Jingdo have been killed. It is impossible for reinforcements to come. Given Fan Xian's personality, he knows it's a dead end. Why would he fight so bravely? If it were any other time, he would have run a long time ago. Yi Zhong's armor was heavy and old and suffused with a dim light. This important figure in the Qing military glanced at his son-in-law. His eyes flashed slightly. Slowly he said, There are so many people in the palace. How can he run? Everyone admitted that if Fan Xian led the Overwatch Council people and ran as soon as he saw the situation was not right, it would be difficult to dig him out in Jingdo, where hundreds of thousands of people lived, even if the eldest princess had many soldiers under her command. Everyone acknowledged Fan Xian's tyrannical strength and ability to escape. Yi Zhong was silent for a moment, and then said, Since Fan Xian isn't running, then he must have something to rely on. The second prince's expression calmed. This noble had listened to his aunt's suggestion and temporarily suppressed his ambitions to stand behind the crown prince, waving flags and shouting war cries. However, the string in his heart had long been plucked countless times. However, the situation was not set in stone. He would not do anything too crazy, particularly compared to the crown prince. He was more afraid of Fan Xian's existence. Fan Xian's attack on the second prince was not only a blow to his strength, but also a great blow to his spirit. The second prince took a deep breath and said, Fan Xian will always pull out his trump card at unexpected times. I have never underestimated him. Yi Zhong suddenly coldly cut him off. However, we can no longer preserve our strength. The great prince is leading thousands of imperial soldiers to defend the royal palace to the death. He also has the Overwatch Council's secret support. His strength is much more tyrannical than we originally thought. As for Taiping District, if we don't go all out to attack, I'm afraid there will be variables if we drag on. The second prince slowly lowered his head and thought about something in his heart. This time, the Qin and Yi families had formed a rebel army to surround the palace. Nominally, they both supported the crown prince's succession. Everyone knew, at least for now, that the Dingzhou Yi family belonged to the second prince. Thus, in the numerous attacks since the morning, the Yi family had not used their full strength. In the direction of Taiping Square, they were particularly careful, because they were worried that they would lose too much of their strength. It was precisely because of this that the rebel army's attacks were not continuous. And all of this was something that the second prince had tacitly agreed to. Yi Zhong glanced at his son-in-law and said in a deep voice, "I trust that Fan Xian has already seen this. I think he will immediately use this to drive a wedge between you and the crown prince. At this juncture, please put aside your past thoughts, and first help the crown prince enter the palace." The second prince took a deep breath. A warm smile rose to his face as he nodded. "Father-in-law is right. We cannot give Fan Xian any opportunity to use. If the crown prince and I continue to be suspicious of each other, it will only make the three brothers in the palace happy." He turned his head to glance at Yi Zhong and solemnly said, "Have the crown prince and old Qin master attack without worry. I'll go to the central camp and ask for the crown prince's instructions." Yi Zhong furrowed his brows slightly. He knew that the second prince was going to use him as a hostage and use his safety to ensure the unity and will of the tens of thousands of rebel soldiers. He was not going to give Fan Xian any opportunity to use them. It's too dangerous. The commander of the Dingzhou army slowly closed his eyes. "As the deputy general, I should go to the central camp to give orders. I'll just take a few trusted soldiers there. The Dingzhou army will be handed over to your highness to deal with. As for all matters regarding the attack on the city, the central camp will send out military orders. There won't be a situation where it is difficult to deliver military orders." The second prince paused. A moment later, he was moved and said with concern, "Father-in-law, be careful." Just as the second prince and Yi Zhong expected, seeing that the Dingzhou army was preserving their strength, Fan Xian would not let go of this opportunity to sow discord. Standing on the top of the city walls and gazing at the rebel army's central camp, he once again began to call out to the crown prince. At this moment, the attack below the city walls was particularly urgent. The sound of drums was like thunder. Cries for killing rose from all directions. There were rebel soldiers climbing up ladders and beginning to brave arrows and rolling stones as they climbed toward the top of the city walls. It was at such a tense moment, and in such a noisy and dangerous environment, that Fan Xian's every word was branded into the ears of all of the rebel soldiers and Qin family generals. He only called out one thing toward the bottom of the palace walls. "Old thief Qin, so many of your people have died. Does it not hurt?" There was not a single word that mentioned the Yi family or the Dingzhou army. However, bodies were scattered across the square. The charred remains of the terrifying rebel soldiers still gave off a nauseating smell. As long as one was not blind, one would notice that the people who had died in these waves of attacks were mostly Qin family soldiers and two subordinates of the Jingdou garrison. Dingzhou had not suffered many losses. After these words were said, the leaders of the rebel army's central camp were all surprised. The crown prince smiled slightly and said to the generals beside him, "Only an idiot would believe such childish sowing discord." Even a blind person could hear Fan Xian's intentions in such an open provocation. Only an idiot would foolishly fall for his trap and begin to suspect each other's intentions. Although the crown prince and second prince had once fought to the death in court, after experiencing the Dong Mountain incident, and under the eldest princess' gentle and powerful suppression, they had no choice but to work closely together. The two Li princes were not idiots. They knew that they had to maintain a semblance of unity and cooperation. However, no matter how simple a plan was, when it was turned into direct words and landed in everyone's ears, it would have some effect on people's emotions, particularly the generals of the Qin family. Although they knew what Fan Xian wanted to achieve, they still couldn't help but feel a glimmer of anger. Since the beginning of the attack, it had always been the Qin family fighting the main force. The Dingzhou army had basically stood to the side and watched coldly. How could the Qin generals feel comfortable? After taking the flag and returning, Gong Dian, who had been standing 2 riders away from the crown prince, began to have an unnatural expression. It was as if he felt a glimmer of shame. Everyone had seen the Dingzhou army's behavior and knew that Yi Zhong and the second prince were certainly planning something in their hearts. Although it would not have much of an impact on the major event, the Qin family would certainly be furious. The crown prince glanced warmly at Gong Dian and said, Fan Xian knows that he has already entered a dead end, which is why he would do such senseless actions. As the saying goes, one should not be surprised by strange things. There are only so many people in the palace. I will use the army to suppress them. As long as we do not fall into chaos ourselves, the major event will eventually succeed. I hope everyone will work hard. Yes, Your Highness. The generals by his side all bowed. They knew that what the Crown Prince said was the correct path. Using the proper path to win through unusual means. If the correct path was magnanimous and powerful, why care about unusual means? With just a slight mention, the Crown Prince crushed Fan Xian's words and tossed them away. The generals began to get busy again. The Crown Prince and the old Qin master said something in a low voice. At the same time, they turned their gaze toward the top of the palace walls. At this moment, a soldier holding a flag arrived on a fast horse. Under everyone's slightly strange gaze, he reported in a loud voice, "Deputy Commander Yi Zhong is here to ask for the Crown Prince's order." The Crown Prince was slightly startled, but his eyes lit up. To the side, the old Qin master suddenly opened his eyes. A cold light shone out but immediately calmed down. The situation was already set. The old Qin master couldn't help but begin to think about his only son, Qin Heng. He wondered what kind of blow he had suffered at Jingyang Gate, and why he had not returned to his troops yet. Although Yi Zhong's arrival was sudden, the old Qin master's heart only jumped slightly before he let it go. The old master guessed why Yi Zhong had come, but he was not worried that Yi Zhong would steal any of the Qin family's achievements. The Qin family's contribution in helping the Crown Prince to the throne was something no one could deny. As long as the Crown Prince ascended to the throne and became emperor, the Qin family could at least enjoy decades of peace after the old master died. The Crown Prince's glimmer of surprise and joy was because he had other thoughts. He knew that Yi Zhong had come because he didn't want Fan Xian's words to affect today's grand plan. However, this respect for him and the importance he placed on the overall situation made the Crown Prince see a glimmer of light. Fan Xian had placed the Empress Dowager and the Empress Dowager's medallions on the top of the palace walls. The Crown Prince and the old Qin master had had a fierce conflict. Although the Crown Prince had forcefully suppressed the thoughts of the Qin family's generals, he had other thoughts in his heart, thoughts that Fan Xian wanted him to have. A few days ago, the Crown Prince and the Empress Dowager had discussed deeply a number of times. They had never made up their minds to have the Qin family lead troops into the capital. They were afraid that the military would dominate in the future. Looking at the situation, the Crown Prince knew that, in the end, he was not his father. His influence on the military was still too small. He had to find some way to balance things out. Yi Zhong's sudden arrival made the Crown Prince find a glimmer of a possibility. Yi Zhong was the second prince's father-in-law. Logically speaking, he should be the person the Crown Prince was most wary of. However, the Crown Prince did not think that the alliance in this world would last forever. Everything was related to profit and had nothing to do with feelings and family. He was the true Crown Prince and was about to ascend to the throne. The Yi family's support of him was much more beneficial than supporting the second prince. Of course, he did not dare hope that the Yi family would suddenly turn to him. These things were problems to be considered a long time later. However, he had discovered this possibility. Li Chengqian felt a slight bitterness in his heart. The group of people below the palace walls were all traitors and immoral. What wouldn't they do? Yi Zhong entered the ranks and bowed solemnly to the Crown Prince. He reported the battle situation in Taiping Square. His trusted soldiers were far away outside the camp. Although the Qin family would not guard against him, they would not allow him to bring his trusted soldiers in. The old Qin master narrowed his eyes and nodded slightly toward Yi Zhong in greeting. Yi Zhong's expression was slightly dark. He was extremely calm. The siege continued. Arrows flew past in all directions. The sound of killing did not stop. There were already clear casualties among the imperial army. However, the royal palace was tall. The palace gates were filled with mountain rocks and sand, so they could still hold. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes as he watched the deaths happen in front of him. He didn't know what he was feeling. At this time, The great prince had already tidied up his light armor and removed the long sword at his waist. He took the long knife he had used to dominate the battlefield from his trusted soldier's hands and silently walked past behind him. Fan Xian suddenly stretched out his hand and grabbed his shoulder. In a low voice he said, "It's better if I go. I admit that you are very powerful, but leading soldiers to charge is not an assassination by one person." The great prince furrowed his brows and said, "It's better if I do this kind of thing. Watch the top of the palace walls. My mother's life is in your hands." Fan Xian was silent. He knew he would not be able to persuade this brother of his, who was about to go into battle. The great prince looked at him and suddenly said, "I wonder if I've gone crazy. To think that I'm going to take these hundreds of people to charge into the camp without knowing anything." He laughed bitterly and spat on the ground. "After I die, if you can escape, remember to burn some paper money for me every year." Fan Xian smiled bitterly. He knew that the custom of the Li family was to burn paper money. Hearing these words, he couldn't help but pat the great prince's shoulder. A moment later he didn't say anything. He only squeezed out, "Big brother, be careful." Hearing the word big brother, the great prince laughed brightly and said, "To suddenly have you admit that I am your big brother at the moment of death is not bad." The great prince knew that Fan Xian didn't even want to acknowledge his father, yet he was willing to acknowledge him as his big brother. There were true emotions within. Fan Xian turned his head and watched the great prince and the imperial army members who were ready and waiting to go into the distance. He watched as they gently stroked the remaining 200 or so warhorses in the royal palace. His gaze gradually grew gentle. He knew that if he lost this gamble, he might have a chance to turn things around. However, these people, as well as most of the people in the palace, would pay with their lives for his gamble. "If you all die, I will use a few years to kill everyone in the Li family to avenge you," Fan Xian said to himself in his heart. Fan Xian thought to himself. His gaze slowly swept past the top of the palace walls and the bottom of the palace walls. It swept past the imperial soldiers, who were bravely resisting the rebel army. He looked at the Overwatch Council's trusted aides who held fast to the crossbows and were responsible for various communications. He looked at the scholars Hu and Shu, who stood with pale faces in front of the palace walls. Shu Wu's white beard floated in the wind and was disheveled. Fan Xian's heart dimmed slightly. He didn't know if this was the last time he would see these people's lively faces. He lowered his head and said a few words to the third prince, Li Qingping. With a clap of his hands, he flipped up and stood on the 3 coffins on the palace walls. The autumn sun was nearing noon, but it suddenly burrowed into the dark clouds that had drifted over. The 3 coffins on the palace walls were painted completely black. Fan Xian was also completely black. He stood calmly on them, facing the slightly cold wind, and looking at all of this vexing scene. Everyone on the palace walls saw this scene. The blood-soaked soldiers didn't have the leisure to watch. However, the people in the rebel army camp couldn't help but feel a chill in their hearts when they saw the black-clothed man standing against the wind on the palace walls. From the start of the battle until now, Fan Xian's little tricks had not had much effect. After Yi Zhong met with the crown prince, there were finally some small changes in the rebel army camp. The entire rebel army camp began to slowly and methodically change formations. The Dingzhou army had to replace the old Qin family and take on a portion of the responsibility of the traitors. This was the scene Fan Xian wanted to see. He watched all of this and found that although the Qing army was well trained, the Yi and Qin families rarely cooperated. When they changed formations, a few gaps finally appeared on the battle lines. The Dingzhou army was still far from moving into position. The Qin family still occupied the center. It was only the spiderweb-like alleys on the upper left that revealed their openings. Fan Xian did not have much military training, but he knew that he could not use those gaps. He could only silently pray in his heart that the good luck that had accompanied him for 20 years would shine brightly at this moment. It was as if heaven had its own will in the dark, and the will of heaven had heard the prayer in Fan Xian's heart. Just as the rebel army's formation change was slightly chaotic, the urgent sound of horse hooves, filled with murderous intent, finally came from the long street near the gap. Fan Xian's spirit rose. Focusing his gaze became very cold. It was not reinforcements. It was Qin Heng. After experiencing the cruel attack at Jingyang Gate, Qin Heng, who had personally experienced the Nanjiao War and was a general behind a family of generals, finally relied on his powerful 5,000 riders to break through the combined attack of the Overwatch Council and Imperial Army riders. After a delay of 2 hours, he finally arrived at the royal palace. In an instant, it could be seen that Qin Heng's subordinates had already charged to the end of the street. It could be seen that the riders were covered in blood and wounds. Of the 5,000 riders, only 3,000 remained. One could imagine how tragic the attack at Jingyang Gate had been. The tip of Fan Xian's heart ached like it had been pierced by a needle. He knew that his most loyal Overwatch Council subordinates had probably suffered heavy losses at Jingyang Gate. No one knew how many had died or been injured. As for the group of Imperial Army the Great Prince had sent out, presumably, they had been completely wiped out. A bitter taste of blood rolled between his lips and tongue. After 2 coughs, Fan Xian stared with blood-red eyes. He knew that while the tyrannical ephedra pill had forcefully raised his realm, it had also deeply injured his heart meridians. He only stared at the opening and watched as the group of riders led by Qin Heng appeared in front of everyone's eyes through smoke and blood. "Do it!" He covered his bleeding lips and spoke indistinctly. Although the order was unclear and his voice was very low, the member of the Qinian unit, who had been waiting by his side the entire time, did not hesitate at all. He raised his right arm and pulled with all his might. The signal arrow in his hand shot into the sky. In the dark and gloomy sky, it exploded into a beautiful firework. From last night until now, it was the second firework in Jingdo. The moment the signal went out, waves of strange sounds rang out from the private residences behind the square in front of the royal palace, attracting the attention of many people. In the middle of the 3 streets to the front and left, a rush of horse hooves suddenly rang out. Qin Heng's riders had already arrived, so where did the sound of horse hooves come from? Who were these determined and hurried riders? Who were even faster and more murderous than the Qin family's blood-soaked riders? Like 2 gusts of wind destined to meet, the riders charging toward the square along the 2 roads at the same time finally met at the intersection of the 2 streets and collided violently and suddenly. There were not many riders hidden in the dark, but they carried with them an aura different from that of normal Qing soldiers. Not only was there a murderous aura, but there was also a sense of the cold underworld. Their entire bodies were covered in black armor. It was as if not even a glimmer of light would be reflected. It was as black as ink. The Overwatch Council's Black Knights were rumored to be the riders with the greatest killing power in the Qing kingdom. However, not many people had seen their method of battle or their great strength. Within the Qing military, many people expressed a disdainful attitude toward the Black Knights. They thought that Chen Pingping, that old dog, could not train iron-blooded riders. Today, this mysterious Black Knight troop finally collided with the elite riders of the Qing kingdom. Furthermore, they used blood-like facts to tell everyone that in terms of the quality of riders, the Black Knights would always be the most valiant. The sudden appearance of the Black Knights was outside of everyone's expectations. A glimmer of excitement flashed through the old Qin master's eyes. At the first moment, he discovered the problem. A cold light flashed through his eyes again. No one knew how Fan Xian had hidden this group of riders among the private residences behind the rebel soldiers. No one knew how this all-black group of dark riders managed to do it without making a single sound. Qin Heng led the riders and sped past the intersection of the street. He then saw the black, heart-palpitating figures of riders charging toward him from the other side of the road. There were too few people in this group of Black Knights, only 200. If the Great Prince was still on top of the palace walls, he would certainly guess that this was the group Fan Xian had sent out of the palace last night. It was the group led by the deputy commander of the Black Knights, Jing Ge, who had disappeared without a trace for a long time. Although there were only 200 people, this group of Shadow Knights seemed to have 2,000 people. No, it was more like one person was fighting. The leader wore a silver mask and gripped his spear tightly. He was like the sharpest point on the edge of a blade, charging at the forefront at an incredible speed. The 200 riders behind him were like a sharp blade and solid blade behind a dagger. They maintained a tight formation and used excellent riding skills to support themselves. They followed closely behind the silver-masked Jing Ge and stabbed viciously into the front of Qin Heng's 2,000 riders. Only the Black Knights would have such determination and daring to fight with 200 against 2,000. Decades ago, the predecessors of the Black Knights had once, under Qin Pingping's lead, launched a surprise attack 3,000 li north and deep into the Wei Kingdom. They had captured the leader of the Wei Kingdom's Tiki, Xiao En, alive and then escaped unscathed. The Black Knights could launch a surprise attack 3,000 li, much less a mere 3,000 zhang. Only those who remembered history well would understand that the Black Knights were the most powerful riders in the world. Only those who remembered history would understand why the Qing Emperor always forcefully ordered Qin Pingping to limit the number of Black Knights to 1,000. Chapter 569. Because it was difficult to write, it was a bit slow. The contents of this chapter satisfied my long-suppressed desire for a story. I wrote what I wanted to write. I am very pleased. At the T-junction, the two groups of riders, who were going to use their collisions to decide life and death, swept out of their respective alleys like two gusts of wind. In the empty space in the northwest corner of the square in front of the palace, they collided together viciously. In the instant before the collision, the black cavalrymen who were charging forward at high speed were fully armored. They held the reins in one hand and did not hold any swords or spears in the other. Instead, they held their crossbows horizontally. Before anyone could react, they pulled the trigger. The Qing Kingdom's riders were skilled in the art of mounted archery. In such a head-on charge, they were usually used to facing each other with knives and spears. Basically, no one would use crossbows to charge. The crossbows themselves were heavy. Furthermore, in such a short distance, if one's movement was slightly slower, the two sides would probably collide before the crossbow could be fired. However, the Black Knights were different. From the first day they entered the Overwatch Council, they had developed this habit. Holding the crossbow with one hand, they remained steady. More accurately speaking, the nearly 1,000 Black Knights of the Overwatch Council were, in reality, a powerful mass assassination and surprise attack weapon. The sound of the arrows breaking through the air rang out. In such a short distance, hundreds of sharp and poisoned crossbow bolts all shot out. They did not give the riders suddenly coming from Xunyang Gate any chance to resist. After countless muffled sounds, countless riders in the front of the riders, suddenly coming from Xunyang Gate, were hit by the crossbow bolts and fell tragically from their horses. However, some persevered on their horses and pulled out knives. With a wild roar, they hacked at the riders coming closer and closer. The Black Knights abandoned their crossbows and pulled out knives from under their saddles. With a backhand slash, the knife turned into a snowy light and directly chopped off the rider's head. 200 Shadow Knights performed the same action at the same time. They abandoned their crossbows cleanly, drew their swords with the force of mountains and rivers, and slashed at the enemy's head with a soul-stirring slash. 200 men neatly performed such a difficult attack, and it looked extremely beautiful on the battlefield. On one side was the group of rebel riders who had bitterly attacked Xunyang Gate. After being strangled for a long time by over 1,000 Overwatch Council subordinates and Imperial soldiers, they had finally managed to clear a path and arrived with great difficulty in front of the royal palace. On one side was the mysterious Black Knights who had endured silently for a long time and built up their strength. Once the commissioner gave the order, they would deliver the Overwatch Council's most powerful attack. The momentum, spirit, and physical strength of both sides were originally not that far apart due to the current situation. However, the gap was suddenly pulled to a point where it was impossible to bear on the battlefield. The 200 Black Knights were like a heated knife. They charged into the Qin family cavalry with incomparable sharpness. They easily and happily cut open a large hole in the formation of the cavalry that had reached into the square of the royal palace. Following the countless spurts of blood and corpses falling from their horses, the Black Knights successfully broke through the Qin family cavalry. They separated Qin Heng and the 300 riders from the main group, making them an isolated army. The Black Knights' riding skills were superb. Amidst their speed, they successfully changed their formation. The entire group suddenly scattered. The riders charging at the very front pulled on the reins to the right. Relying on their extraordinary speed and powerful momentum, they blocked off the main group of riders behind them. The remaining 100 or so Black Knights stabbed to the left like a pack of wolves. They quickly picked their targets and pressed close to where Qin Heng was in the vanguard camp. They stuck closely together and used the knives in their hands to bite and kill. In an instant, the vanguard camp Qin Heng was in had suffered heavy casualties. The hearts of the main group of riders in the back had been shaken by this thunderous attack. For a moment, they were unable to charge forward to help. Although there were many rebel soldiers in the square, there was still a distance between them. Particularly as the rebel army was changing their formation, the situation was slightly chaotic. Looking at the Black Knights' lightning-like speed, no one knew whether or not they would be able to completely kill these hundreds of riders when the main group came to surround them. The hoofs of the horses were like thunder. The horses under the Black Knights silently advanced with all their might. The horses under the Qin family riders neighed and ran wildly, just like the mood of their masters on their backs. The speed of the Black Knights' pursuit was too fast. In a moment, they had chased Qin Heng's vanguard camp into the square for some distance, and separated from the main group behind them. This scene was truly frightening to watch. There were rebel soldiers all around them. The old Qin master and Yi Zhong had long reacted. They ordered the rebel soldiers to quickly close up the gap in the northwest. They had to make contact with Qin Heng before the Black Knights succeeded. If they allowed the tens of thousands of rebel soldiers to successfully surround them, no matter how tyrannical the Black Knights were, only death awaited them. Even if the Black Knights successfully followed Fan Xian's orders to kill Qin Heng, they would probably still die in the end. However, the Black Knights, led by Jing Ge, did not seem to consider this at all. Under the gazes of tens of thousands of people, surrounded by countless rebel soldiers, and in the spacious square in front of the palace, they fearlessly chased after the tail of Qin Heng's vanguard camp bravely and somewhat arrogantly. Dusk gradually rose. Under the eyes of tens of thousands of rebel soldiers, 100 or so Black Knights chased after hundreds of elite Qin family riders. This kind of decisive stance, this kind of arrogant and disdainful aura, and this heart-shaking scene would remain in people's memories for a long time. In a dragon of dust, hundreds of riders risked their lives in pursuit from the northwest corner of the square, all the way to the center of the square. Qin Heng was not a weakling. Otherwise, he could not have become the second youngest commander of the Jingdo garrison after Yi Zhong at the age of 30. He also could not have become the deputy of the Bureau of Military Affairs at such a young age. As for the situation on the battlefield, this second-generation leading figure of the Qin family had, without question, his own wisdom and judgment. He was good at leading troops and reacted quickly. When the shadows of the Black Knights appeared beside his eyes, he immediately made a decision and carried out the first head-on charge. As long as they could stand against the first wave of attacks, the main force in the rear would continue to come. The opponent's mere 200 riders would not be able to affect them at all. However, the battle in Jingdo was truly too different from the killing on the battlefield. The street fighting under Xingyang Gate was also very different from the street fighting described in military books. Qin Heng had never thought that the Overwatch Council, a department that relied on intelligence and assassination, would be able to explode with such power in street fighting and cause the Qin family riders to suffer heavy losses. At the same time, they had used up too much of their morale, mental and physical strength. The most important thing was that Qin Heng had never thought that a mere 200 Black Knights would actually have such a powerful aura, a fast charging force, and an extremely cold killing method. He had never thought that the 500 riders in the vanguard would not even be able to stand against the opponent's first wave of attacks, and be ruthlessly cut in half by the opponent. Qin Heng's heart was cold, but his reaction was strangely fast. He whipped his horse and did not stay where he was to fight against the Black Knights. Instead, he increased his speed and led his riders toward the center of the square. All around them were rebel soldiers. As long as they entered the encirclement, the Black Knights could only wait for death. What he had to do was be fast as possible. It should be said that Qin Heng's reaction was strangely fast. The training of the Qin family riders was also very effective. Although the Black Knights were like a pack of wolves charging and biting, the vanguard still successfully escaped from the Ding family road into the square. However, the Black Knights were faster and more ruthless. They were not left behind at all. Instead, they faintly formed an encirclement. The silver-masked leader of the Black Knights charged over from the side. He was only 3 horse lengths away from Qin Heng. A cold light shot out of Qin Heng's eyes inside his helmet. The bravery of the Black Knights was beyond his expectations. The other party actually dared to chase him deep into the rebel army's encirclement. It looked like they were prepared to stab him to death, even if it meant risking their lives. However, he knew that the Black Knight's ambush had already failed. He knew that his old father would not just watch him die. At the same time, the rebel army's camp change was halfway through. They discovered that Qin Heng was in deep danger. Naturally, they sent out 2 large groups to come to his aid. At the same time, they intended to completely wipe out the Black Knights, who seemed to have suddenly descended from the heavens. However, these 2 groups were still some distance away from the Dust Dragon. Most of them were infantry. If they could keep up with the Black Knight's ambush and Qin Heng's extraordinary speed of running for his life. At this moment, a mighty order rang out from the rebel army's camp. Release! There was the Lord God tablet on the palace walls. The rain of arrows did not have the glory of landing. The soul-stirring scene in the square could not stop the old Qin master's determination. Following this order, countless arrows flew toward the Dust Dragon. The sound of the arrows piercing through the air rang out in a continuous stream. It enveloped all of the riders who were fighting with their lives on the line. They did not care that the Black Knights were chasing their own riders. Qin Heng had long guessed that his father would never have any hesitation on the battlefield. He also knew that this rain of arrows would arrive. His face was ashen, and the high speed caused his lips to turn white. Before the rain of arrows arrived, he had already flipped his body and shot towards the back of his mount. The merciless arrows pierced into everyone's bodies, breaking through the bodies of the charging cavalrymen. The spinning arrows tore through the cavalrymen's light armor, pierced through the human's brittle skin, and pierced into their internal organs and bones. In an instant, the riders on both sides charging at high speed were attacked by the rain of arrows at the same time. One by one, they fell off their horses and fell to the ground. Their bones and flesh separated from their bodies with a series of muffled thuds. Regardless of whether it was the Qin family's riders or the Overwatch Council's Black Knights, they all met the same fate, a wretched fate. Although the Black Knight's armor was specially made by the palace treasury's 3rd workshop and was lighter and better than the Qing army's elite armor, they still suffered heavy losses under this round of arrow rain. The Qin family's own riders also met with a disaster. The crown prince abruptly turned his head and looked at the old Qin master in disbelief. It was as if he had not thought he would give such a terrifying order. Was he not worried about Qin Heng's life or death? Furthermore, these 200 Black Knights could not cause any major damage. To use this rain of arrows to kill without distinguishing between friend and foe, was he not worried that it would destabilize the army's morale? The old Qin master narrowed his eyes. A cold light shone through the 2 small cracks. Of all the people present, only he knew what the goal of the Black Knights was. Only he knew that if he allowed these 200 Black Knights to continue their pursuit, the vanguard camp led by Qin Heng would not be able to escape before the rebel army's reinforcements arrived. He knew the power of the Black Knights. He thought that Fan Xian's arrangement at Jingyang Gate and the Black Knights lying in ambush here were all because of the words that had made him extremely angry earlier on the palace walls. I want the Qin family line to end without descendants. The old Qin master was a ruthless person. Since Fan Xian wanted to end his line, he would rather do it himself than humbly watch as the people Fan Xian had arranged killed his son. Furthermore, how could the son of the Qin family die so easily? Qin Heng did not die. His mount was covered in arrows. After 2 mournful cries, it fell heavily toward the ground. Because he had been prepared, although he had been hit heavily by the forward roll of the horse after it fell to the ground, and the armor on his body even created countless weak sparks because of the friction with the ground. He had already dissipated most of the force. Furthermore, with the cover of his mount, he was not hit by the arrows. There was only one wave of arrows, and then it stopped. Most of the pursuing cavalrymen had already fallen into pools of blood. Although the shadow cavalry had more survivors, they had also lost their mounts and suffered heavy or light injuries. However, they did not panic. Instead, they continued to raise their sabers and charged at the Qin family cavalrymen who had fallen to the ground. At this time, Qin Hung had already stood up. The rebel army reinforcements around him also quickly approached. Jing Ge, the silver-masked deputy commander of the Black Knights, had become the tip of the Black Knight's spear from the beginning of the battle. With the most decisive stance and the fastest speed, he stared fixedly at Qin Hung, not letting him out of his line of sight. As the rain of arrows came, Jing Ge and his horse also received a terrible blow. An arrow very cleverly passed through the armor on his body and slanted into his left shoulder. A streak of blood quickly seeped out. The front legs of the horse under him also weakened and silently fell to the ground. His feet landed heavily on the saddle. In the instant that the rain of arrows stopped, he held the long black spear in his hand and leapt out like a wolf king, carrying with it a thirst for blood that had been hidden for many years. His power could not be stopped. The distance of 30 feet was covered in a flash. Qin Hung had just pulled his leg out from under his horse and stood up with great difficulty. It looked like his mental and physical strength had been exhausted to the extreme. With the sharp killing intent of the black spear pointed at him, it seemed that he could only wait helplessly for death. But no one would have thought that Qin Hung's body, which looked extremely tired, actually had energy again at this moment. With a fierce shout, he did not turn around, but had already pulled out his sword. His entire body quickly began to spin, and like a shadow, he very strangely brushed past the sharp black spear shadow. Jing Ji's spear stabbed out with all his might. He had not expected his opponent to have such an ingenious movement to counter the spear. His entire mind and spirit were focused on this spear. The tip of the spear missed and stabbed viciously into the stone floor of the square beside Qin Hung. With a crack, the stone floor was shattered into countless pieces. In that muffled sound, Qin Hung's body did not stop spinning. In a moment he was close to Jing Ji's body. With a cold huff, his left elbow shot out, and the blade of the sword in his hand sliced toward Jing Ji's neck. One flash, one turn, and one slash. Such a clean and efficient three-hit combo was used in such a complicated battlefield situation. Qin Hung was indeed valiant. No wonder the old Qin master had so much confidence in him, to let him face the silver-masked Jing Ji's sudden attack alone. At such a close distance, such a vicious slash would probably be difficult for even Fan Xian to block. Jing Ge was probably dead for sure. During this soul-stirring chase, the rebel army's attacks on the royal palace never stopped. The heavy carriages that were used to ram into the palace gates still did not know fatigue. They were not afraid of falling rocks or burning the ground. They continued to ram into the 3 palace gates one after another. A loud muffled sound reverberated throughout the royal palace from time to time. It sounded like a soul-shaking drum beat. In the last moment of the strange chase in the square, when Qin Hung's sword was only 3 inches from Jing Ji's neck, a shocking change occurred in the attack and defense of the palace doors. With a loud bang, the heavy palace door in the middle was smashed open. In this instant, all of the rebel soldiers could not believe their eyes. Immediately after, wild joy and excitement took over. The Black Knights had already been defeated, Jing Ge was about to die, and the palace doors had already been opened. The scales of victory had, without question, thrown away all barriers. They began to cowardly snuggle up behind the rebel army. Looking at this scene, the crown prince's spirit rose. He glanced at the old Qin master, and Yi Zhong beside him, and took a deep breath. Attack with full power. Fan Xian stood on top of the black coffin, and gently used the tip of his foot to tap a rhythm no one could understand. He watched these fatal changes happen in a flash on the palace walls, but he still did not make a decision. He kicked open the coffin with one foot, and took out the heavy sniper rifle inside. Because he was standing higher than everyone else, just as Chen Pingping had once taught him, he could see further than everyone else. He could see some details that no one else had noticed. He saw that the generals of the Dingzhou family were still in the rebel army camp in the west, discussing something with the second prince. They gradually moved closer and naturally isolated the second prince's trusted aides on the outside. He saw that in the rebel army camp, Yi Zhong's expression was as calm as usual beside the crown prince, who showed a joyous expression for the first time. However, Gong Dian had lagged a step behind. During the process of the rebel army changing camps, and the chaos brought by rescuing Qin Heng, the Dingzhou army gradually changed their formation. Although it was subtle, it was particularly piercing in Fan Xian's eyes, who was looking down from above. If a complicated situation was made up of countless pictures, then in Fan Xian's eyes, these pictures were undergoing changes that no one understood. However, he knew that his gamble would determine the final success or failure based on the changes in these pictures. He tied the Wei Emperor's sword tightly to his back and pulled on the hook the third bureau had prepared for him 2 years ago. Glancing in the direction of the city guarding crossbows, he narrowed his eyes slightly and said, "Get ready." Then, he tapped the coffin with the tip of his foot for the last time, thinking, "I still won't use you today." The change in the images suddenly occurred in the next moment. This change would decide the future of the Qin kingdom. It was destined to become something that young historians with a conscience in the future would discuss enthusiastically. The first scene to change was the silver-masked Jingge, who was about to face death, lowering his head the moment the tip of Qin Heng's sword reached his neck. Jingge lowered his head. In the time it took for a spark to fly off a piece of flint, lowering his head looked simple, but it was actually extremely difficult. However, he had done it so naturally and quickly. It was as if 500 years ago, Jingge already knew where Qin Heng's sword would come from and where it would go. He had already simulated it countless times and had long been prepared to meet the edge of this sword. It was this gentleness of lowering his head that allowed Qin Heng's murderous sword to cut across Jing Ji's silver mask and draw out a streak of silver sparks. However, it did not cut his neck. What was even more unexpected was that Jing Ji's spear, which seemed to have poured all of his spirit into it, pierced empty air and broke the stone floor on the ground. It seemed to have a life of its own and quickly bounced back. Following the empty space between his thumb and index finger, it bounced back with a bang. Jing Ji's hand gripped the tip of the spear tightly 3 inches below and abruptly stabbed upward. All of this happened too quickly. The silver mask on Jing Ji's face was still sparking when the tip of the spear in his hand had already pierced ruthlessly into Qin Heng's jaw. With a muffled crack, the sharp tip of the spear pierced straight through Qin Heng's jaw into his brain. Fresh blood sprayed out. Qin Heng's body froze and then went limp. He died just like that. Jingge gripped the shaft of the spear tightly. The tip of the spear held Qin Heng's body. With a crisp sound, Jing Ji's silver mask broke in half and slid to the ground, revealing his true face. It was the face that Fan Xian had always wanted to see. It was the face that had been hidden under the silver mask ever since he had been fished out of the Black Prison by Chen Pingping and became a member of the Black Knights. The features of this face were delicate and pretty, but from the left ear to the bottom of the right ear, it had been viciously sliced open in the middle by some unknown sharp weapon. It was a very old injury, but it still appeared terrifying. One could imagine what kind of injury he had suffered in the past. The wound was large, revealing the bone, flesh, and white teeth inside. It appeared unusually terrifying. Although Qin Heng's earlier strike had been blocked by his silver mask, the sword intent still struck his face and shook open his old wound. Fresh blood gradually flowed out, making him appear even more savage. The entire square was completely silent as they looked at this scene in shock. They looked at the savage commander of the Black Knights, using the tip of the spear in his hand to hold up the old Qin master's only son. Involuntarily, they thought of Fan Xian's curse of ending the Qin family line. Fresh blood dripped down from Qin Heng's throat and slid along the long sword to Jing Ji's hand. Jingge was silent. He was thinking back then, Your brother had used this move to ruin my face. These years, my hatred toward the Qin family caused me to wear a silver mask and constantly ponder the Qin family's methods on the killing field. Today you still use this move. If you die at my hands, don't cry injustice. Jing Ge held up Qin Heng's body and looked toward where the old Qin master was in the rebel camp. In a stern voice he said, I am Jing Ge. Chapter 570. I saw a post in the book review section and was very angry and sad. I wrote a very long piece of gossip. After calmly thinking for a long time, I decided to delete it all because today is a joyous day. I will continue not to look at the book review section. Unfortunately, I may miss many good book reviews. After all, the leader also has to go to work. He can't keep an eye on it all the time. Everyone can also post the book reviews they value to the club. The club is in the relevant club on the right side of the page. It's called Qing Yunyan Cat Fan, Old P, Yuan and Bachelor. Those good managers will certainly value it very much. Thank you for your hard work. Add a sentence. After I finished writing yesterday afternoon, I found that I was sick again. So those who said I was pretending to be sick can continue. Then, I sincerely call for monthly votes to everyone. Those who scolded me for not writing enough and dragging on, and still have the nerve to ask for votes, can also continue. I wish everyone a happy life and a happy Olympics. I will continue to write this story seriously. Please read it happily. Qin Heng's body hung from Jing Ji's spear. Fresh blood dripped down. In this moment, his chest was filled with the joy of revenge and the smell of blood. He wanted to shout to his heart's content in this encirclement of tens of thousands of soldiers. He had finally avenged his family. After hiding in the darkness for so many years, he had finally avenged his family. Outside Jiaozhou, he had told Fan Xian of his past for the first time. Half a year later, Fan Xian had quietly promised to give him a chance for revenge. Jing Ge didn't know what power Sir Fan Jr. had to help him fulfill his wish, but his wish had finally become reality. Joy, boundless joy and murderous intent made Jing Ge laugh happily. The wretched wound had split open between his ears like a clown's mouth. Because of his laughter, it opened wider and wider. It looked particularly terrifying and miserable. Tears rolled down his face like rain. The people who saw this scene all felt a chill rise from the depths of their hearts. Riding on the horse, the old Qin master's heart felt like it was being torn apart. His vision darkened, but he valiantly sat straight on the horse. He did not let anyone notice that he was almost unable to endure the mental decline. The old Qin master's face was pale, and his white hair fluttered in the wind. He looked at his only son, who had been stabbed by the monstrous Shadow Knight's spear, without saying a word. At this moment, the second scene in the scene that was quietly changing like an undercurrent in the imperial city also changed. It was as if a divine painter was splashing ink all over the mountains, sprinkling tens of thousands of vermilion dots. Suddenly, countless wildflowers bloomed in the mountains, turning from a desolate scene to a bountiful harvest. The main palace gate was smashed open by the rebel army's heavy chariots. The rebel army was shouting as they charged inside. However, a large blade was swung out from the palace gate, bringing with it a cold light and a streak of blood. Several heads fell to the ground. He waved his broadsword again. In a flash of cold light, the silver-armored first prince rode on his horse. With an indomitable aura, he leaped out of the palace gates like a god, his broadsword opening up a bloody path. Creak, creak, creak. The heads of the vanguard of the rebel army fell. The first prince gave a roar. Holding the long broadsword in his hand, he led the 200 imperial soldiers behind him in a sudden charge. Unexpectedly, the moment the palace gates were broken open, they charged out first. This was the first true attack of the people in the royal palace. The sound of horse hooves thundering rang out. Although only a small path had been cleared out of the mountain rocks and sand inside the palace gates, it did not stop the speed of the first prince's counterattack. The 200 imperial soldiers quickly rode out. Relying on their high-speed charge and excellent riding skills, they broke open a large gap in the vanguard of the rebel army in front of the palace gates like a knife cutting through tofu. Wherever the cold light passed, no one could stop it. Those who dared were turned into corpses and severed limbs on the ground. In just an instant, the imperial soldiers had charged out nearly 200 feet from the suddenly opened palace gates. Like a silver stream, they were unstoppable. At this time, the rebel army had already begun to charge toward the broken palace gates. They were densely packed like locusts filling the sky, making one shiver in fear. Although the 200 imperial soldiers were powerful, in front of such a powerful rebel army, they were only as thick as a silver thread. However, the first prince was not afraid. Since he trusted Fan Xian, he had already cast aside his own life and death. As he charged, he flipped his wrist. The broadsword drew an arc in the air and chopped straight down toward his right. With a crisp crack, the short spear in a rebel army officer's hand snapped in half. The broadsword chopped into the officer's shoulder. The first prince furrowed his brows and gave a muffled grunt. Gathering strength from his waist, he moved his arm. With a swish, the blade of the broadsword broke out of his body and immediately chopped the officer's body in half. Immediately after, the first prince bent his body and avoided a spiked stick flying toward his face. At this moment, he dragged the broadsword in his hand behind him and spun it around his waist. Using his powerful arm strength, he chopped down diagonally. The edge of the broadsword whistled through the air and domineeringly chopped off the head of the rebel soldier on his left. With a light slap, countless drops of blood sprayed onto the first prince's silver armor. The long broadsword in his hand was also stained with thick blood. The silver and red added together was just like the bright red cloak he usually liked to wear. Following the imperial soldier's desperate attack, it became a line of blood. It appeared exceptionally shocking and magnificent. His helmet pressed down on the first prince's sword-like brows. A wildfire burned in his eyes. Bravely and unstoppably, he led his subordinates and charged toward the rebel army's camp in the distance. Who knew how many obstructions and killings he would encounter along the way? Perhaps he would never be able to charge in front of Li Chengqian, but he still had to charge. He was the commander of the Qing Kingdom's Western Expedition Army, and the only person of the royal family who had experience on the battlefield. Even if he didn't understand Fan Xian's intentions, since he had accepted this mission, he had to see it through to the end. He was not a martial ace, but he was a fierce general in the army. The attack and defense battles in Jingdo could not bring out his ability to command in field battles. However, the first prince had never been afraid of charging and breaking through enemy lines. Horse fighting skills on the battlefield were completely different from battles between aces. What was important was momentum. The first prince's momentum had, without question, been raised to its peak by his determination to die. As a child of mixed blood between Dongyi and the Qing Kingdom, from a certain point of view, he was not favored by the emperor. However, he had strong feelings for this land. An arrow shot out from the dark and was chopped aside by the tip of his broadsword. However, it caused his figure to pause. The countless spears of the rebel soldiers below his horse drew a few bloody wounds on his body. Fortunately, the horse was fast and did not fall into the encirclement. Instead, he killed his way through and continued charging toward the rebel army camp. There was still a long way to go, but the 200 imperial soldiers gave one the feeling that they would charge in front of the crown prince in the next moment. Fan Xian stood on the black coffin and watched everything below the palace walls nervously. When the great prince charged into his field of vision through the palace doors below the palace walls, he immediately gave an order. Open the way for His Highness. There were not many imperial soldiers and Overwatch Council subordinates left on the palace walls. Most of them were doing their best to hold out against the rebel soldiers climbing up the palace walls using ladders. Relying on the 4 hours of preparation in the early hours of the morning, not a single rebel soldier had climbed to the top of the palace walls. However, they had long received military orders. Although they were secretly afraid, they still carried out Fan Xian's orders without any delay. They left the area of the palace walls they were guarding and quickly moved toward the center. They fired out the few arrows in their hands without holding back at all. The arrows were concentrated like rain, all of them landing in front of the great prince's imperial army's path of attack. They all landed on the heads of the rebel soldiers and immediately caused great damage. It also reduced the resistance on the Great Prince's path of attack. However, the defenses in the other areas of the royal palace became weaker. Without the protection of arrows, the rebel soldiers on the ladders seemed to have taken stimulants. They climbed bravely, and were about to reach the top of the palace walls. The imperial soldiers pulled their bowstrings with all their might. They could not feel the pain in their arms, or the blood on their fingers from the vibrations of the bowstrings. They were under Duke Fan's orders to use the bows and arrows in their hands to open the way for the prince. What if the rebel soldiers attacked the royal palace? The prince was leading 200 brothers in an attack amidst the encirclement of the rebel soldiers. If their bows and arrows slowed for a moment, and the prince was injured, what would happen? Terror, unease, heroism, and all kinds of emotions rolled through the hearts of the imperial soldiers on the palace walls. The rebel soldiers had already climbed up the ladders to the top of the palace walls. Although there were not many people on the palace walls, they were all good men of the Qin family's army. With great difficulty, they found their footing and began to expand their positions to open a path for the rebel soldiers behind them. At the palace gate below the palace walls, the 200 imperial soldiers had already charged out. The rebel soldiers could not stop them, so they charged in through the broken palace gate and fought with the remaining defensive forces in the palace. The royal palace was about to fall, and the great prince was still charging through the rebel soldiers below the palace walls. At this moment there were two muffled hums. The two giant city-guarding crossbows, which had stopped for a while, finally began to fire again. This time, the fire was not aimed at the battered carriages charging through the gate, or the three-section cloud carriages being transported in. Instead, under Fan Xian's strong request, they all landed among the rebel soldiers, right in front of the great prince's path of attack. It was just like where the imperial soldiers' arrows were pointing. The giant crossbows landed and pierced through the bodies of countless rebel soldiers, sending up waves of bloody mist. They then stabbed heavily into the stone slabs. Some bounced up. The massive weight and powerful force of impact were enough to crush a few people to death. The sudden powerful rain of arrows and the terrifyingly powerful crossbow bolts greatly supported the great prince's attack. They opened up a bloody path right in the middle of the rebel army. The great prince led the imperial army. Like a silver line, they followed this bloody path and bravely attacked the rebel army's camp. The rebel soldiers clearly had the advantage in numbers. Seeing the great prince's magnificent and heroic figure on the horse, they felt their hearts tremble for no reason. The Qing army placed the most importance on military service. Everyone knew that for many years, it was this great prince who had led the army in battle against the Hu people on the western frontier. He had never tasted defeat, and had performed a great service for the Qing kingdom. The great prince had also become a famous general in the army. The sense of pressure and force of impact, created by a famous general leading an attack, was not something a normal person could stand against. Fan Xian looked at the heroic scene and took a deep breath. The two slowly moving circulations in his body suddenly sped up. He gradually removed the layer of Tianyi Dao Zhenqi from the meridians in his body and allowed the ruthless and tyrannical Zhenqi to begin to circulate valiantly through his body. The blood veins in his eyes grew thicker and thicker. The effect of the medicine had reached its peak. He gripped the grappling hook in his hand tightly and waited for the sound of the last crossbow bolt. Jing Ge, who had killed Qin Heng, had already been surrounded by the rebel soldiers who had arrived first. The old Qin master coldly and listlessly pulled back his gaze and turned it toward the chaos in front of him that was still far away. He knew that the great prince had already begun to lead the counterattack. He knew how wild and heroic the great prince's battle style was. If the other side still had 3,000 riders, perhaps the old Qin master would temporarily avoid the other side's attack. However, the rebel army's victory was already set. They had already broken through the palace gates on the city walls. At such a critical moment, the old Qin master would not retreat even one step. This was a natural intuition formed after decades on the battlefield. Looking at the great prince's blood-soaked heroic figure, and thinking of the scene of his only son's tragic death earlier, the old Qin master suddenly felt that he had grown old. He was even about to smell the scent of death. The pain that had been hidden deep in his heart made him make a wrong decision after a moment of hesitation. The enemy's final crazy counterattack cannot be underestimated. The old Qin master coughed and said to his trusted family general, "Take the crown prince to the back of the camp." The crown prince glanced at the old Qin master. He originally did not want to retreat, but the crown prince did not know military affairs and was unwilling to interfere with old General Qin's troops at such a critical moment. He could only leave quietly. The old Qin master was an old general on the battlefield. When the great prince's final counterattack came, he chose to be as still as a mountain. It was naturally the best decision. However, personally seeing the tragedy of his only son's death made him more conservative. He had his family general lead the crown prince to temporarily avoid the great prince's counterattack. With this, there were only 8 Qin family generals left at his side. Perhaps, as a 9th-level ace, the old Qin master did not care about anything. But Fan Xian cared. The massive city-guarding crossbows had finally used up all of their arrows. The rain of arrows from the imperial army had also become sparse. The imperial army troops led by the great prince, after paying a heavy price, were still unable to break into the rebel army's camp. Perhaps miracles could happen on the battlefield, but to rely on 200 riders to carry out a successful counterattack was no longer a miracle. It was wishful thinking. The great prince had fought until now, bathed in blood. He had already killed a long bloody path. His valiant battle abilities on the battlefield had already scared countless rebel soldiers to death. At this moment, the royal palace was about to fall. The great prince was surrounded. The remaining Black Knights and Jinggu were surrounded. The situation was already set. Even the sound of the last city-guarding crossbow was very different from the previous dozen arrows. It flew out at an angle and gave off a sorrowful whimper. After the last arrow was shot, the 2 city-guarding crossbows fell silent. Everyone seemed to clearly hear the sorrowful sound of the arrow and capture the trajectory of the arrow as it tore through the air. No one noticed that the trajectory of this arrow was completely different from the one that had opened up a path for the great prince. This arrow flew at an angle and swept over the heads of all the rebel soldiers. It did not cause any damage. Instead, it slowly used up its energy in the air. After flying a long distance, it landed heavily in front of the rebel army camp. Although the arrow had flown far, it did not pose any threat. In the end, it fell miserably to the ground like a piece of scrap metal. It did not hit a single rebel soldier. It only gave them a fright. With a muffled pop, the arrow was like a child playing with a knife. The lucky arrow pointed downward and pierced into the earth between the stone slabs, standing upright. At this moment, everyone on and below the city wall saw a scene that made their hearts tremble. A black-clothed person floated down from above the imperial city, like a ghost emerging from the depths of the earth. Following the trajectory of the crossbow arrow, he swiftly flew down from the imperial city in the air, where there was no point of contact. The black-clothed person moved very quickly. It was as if he was tearing through the air. From high above the palace walls, in the blink of an eye, he flew to the top of the rebel army's battle formation. The end of the last arrow had a rope tied to it. The black-clothed person used a grappling hook to slide down along the rope and kill his way into the rebel army camp. Like a black god descending, this scene dumbfounded countless people. They were intimidated by the powerful killing intent and aura in the air. Finally, someone reacted and discovered the rope tied to the end of the last arrow that had fallen heavily to the ground. He roared, "Cut the rope!" Numerous bright knives chopped at the rope tied tightly to the end of the arrow. The old Qin master's gaze grew slightly cold, looking at the black shadow charging at him with incredible speed. The pain and anger in his heart exploded once again. His body trembled. The first prince's courageous attack, and the black-clothed man's descent from the sky, had unavoidably distracted him. In particular, the tragic death of his only son had caused this powerful figure to finally reveal a gap in his state of mind. Just as the old Qin master's state of mind trembled slightly, a knife light also lit up at the corner of his eyes. This knife light was not chopping toward the rope at the end of the arrow. Instead, It was chopping toward the old Qin master's body. A muffled crack exploded in the rebel army camp. Gong Dian's armor clinked wildly from the Jinqi in his body. The powerful Jinqi made his hair stand on end. His hands gripped the straight knife in his hands tightly and chopped toward the old Qin master's neck. This strike contained all of the power in Gong Dian's body. The power at the peak of the 8th level exploded into this strike that he had waited many years for. A glimmer of anger and disbelief flashed through the old Qin master's eyes. His face flushed red as his hand clamped down tightly on Gong Dian's brutal strike. Fresh blood dripped from between the old Qin master's thumb and index finger. Faced with this extremely sinister assassination attempt, the first elder of the Qing army, a superior 9th level ace, still trembled like he had when he saw Fan Xian descend from the sky. With just a slight tremble, the old Qin master's flushed face immediately became a deathly white. Gong Dian could no longer hold onto his long knife. There was another person who attacked at the same time as Gong Dian, a very heavy and powerful person. Yi Zhong's attack was very heavy. It was so heavy that it seemed to carry with it the wind and sand of the Dingzhou desert. It carried with it some mysterious intent. Decisively and mercilessly, it tore apart the body of a rebel general between him and the old Qin master, and struck the old Qin master's abdomen. Yi Zhong and Gong Dian attacked the old Qin master at the same time. This scene happened too suddenly, too strangely, and too unbelievable. Even the old Qin master did not understand what meaning it contained. His personal family warriors had already escorted the crown prince to the side palace. But the 8 generals at his side could not react at all. After this massive muffled sound, dust and smoke rose up in the rebel army camp. The dust and smoke settled slightly. The 3 warhorses under the 3 people were shaken by the powerful Jinqi. They didn't even have time to cry out before they exploded and died. The old Qin master spat out a mouthful of fresh blood. A terrifying wound appeared on his abdomen. His hand, which had quickly reached down like a withered bamboo, was already tightly gripping Yi Zhong's wrist that held the knife. Yi Zhong lowered his head. His brows were as steady as a mountain. The Jinqi in his body flowed out without holding back. With a muffled grunt, he took a step forward and pressed down again. The old Qin master's body trembled again. A powerful force exploded out from his old body. His left elbow flicked out. Holding Gong Dian's steel knife in his hand, the tip of his elbow had already smashed ruthlessly into Gong Dian's chest. With a pft, Gong Dian spat out a mist of blood that filled the air. However, he borrowed the momentum of spitting out blood to let out an explosive roar. Without any regard for his own safety, he pressed his entire body forward. With a press of the blade, the old Qin master's left hand was pressed against his neck, giving off a terrifying creaking sound. All of this happened in a very short amount of time. Yi Zhong knew that he only had one chance. Given his mountain-like personality, he would not pass it up. He took a deep breath and his chest expanded. His left hand shook and quickly became like a metal plate, breaking free of the old Qin master's unusually powerful control. This left hand became a metal plate. With the power of a coffin breaker, it landed heavily on the old Qin master's bleeding chest wound. The Yi family's hand skills were the best in the world. The powerful force of impact pushed the 3 top aces of the Qing military back on the stone floor. Along the way, they shattered the ground and sent up smoke and dust. At this moment, the rope behind the crossbow had been cut. Fan Xian, dressed in black, fell from midair. However, he did not fall into the encirclement of the rebel soldiers. Instead, the tip of his foot pushed off the helmet of a rebel soldier. Like a streak of smoke, he pierced straight into the rebel camp. Yi Zhong's coffin breaker landed viciously on the wound in the old Qin master's waist. Fan Xian shrunk into a ball of black shadow and immediately unfurled. With 2 swishing sounds, his left hand pulled out the sword of the Wei Emperor tied to his back. His right hand pulled out the black dagger he had taken from Lady Ning. With a sword in one hand and a dagger in the other, he turned into a streak of black smoke and swept past the heads of the 8 Qin family generals in the rebel camp. With a number of crisp sounds, 5 of the generals died with their throats slit. 3 of them retreated with chest injuries. Although it was only one exchange, Fan Xian had already unleashed the most power he had since his rebirth. Like a giant bird returning to the forest, he flew toward the three people fighting like wild beasts. The old Qin master, who was injured, let out a wild roar. With a flip of his hand, he pulled back his fingers and struck heavily on Yi Zhong's left shoulder, who did not care for his life and did not care about defense. The strike shattered Yi Zhong's left shoulder. The foot under his body stomped heavily on the ground, leaving a footprint, and brought his body flying backward. Yi Zhong gave a muffled grunt. Using the coffin breaker technique of closing the coffin, he locked onto the old Qin master's wildly overflowing and endlessly trembling right hand. Gong Dian's entire body was covered in blood. He wrapped one hand around the old Qin master's left arm and stuck his body to it. He used his body to press down on the two knives between the two of them. Through the old Qin master's powerful palm, he pressed down toward his neck. The three of them tangled together and quickly retreated over 30 meters. With a crash, they smashed through the wall of a wooden building at the back of the square and sent up countless clouds of dust. However, someone was faster than them. Fan Xian flew in like a black bird and arrived in front of the old Qin master like lightning. The long sword in his hand flipped and pierced into the old Qin master's lower abdomen with a clang. Blood blossomed as the long sword entered the body. Fan Xian lowered his head to hold the sword. With a muffled grunt, he continued to stab forward. The powerful force caused the bodies of the four warriors to smash through the second wall of the building, the third wall, and sent up countless clouds of dust. It hid this sinister, shameless, and bloody murder in a place where tens of thousands of people could not see. The buildings and scenery around them flowed like they were going back in time. Fan Xian, Yi Zhong, and Gong Dian did not let go. Although these three sinister assassins knew that the old Qin master had suddenly been ambushed and had suffered injuries that were difficult to recover from under the combined attack of two 9th-level aces and an 8th-level brave warrior, no one could predict what kind of brilliance this elder of the Qing military would explode with in the last moments of his life. With a muffled boom, this barbaric assassination was finally stopped in front of the last wall. Yi Zhong continued to use the coffin breaker technique to tightly grip the old Qin master's most powerful right hand. Gong Dian continued to press down on the old Qin master's left arm. Fan Xian still maintained his half-crouched stabbing position. His hands trembled as he held the blood-covered sword. Only the hilt of the sword was exposed outside the old Qin master's abdomen. The old Qin master's grizzled hair was disheveled, but a terrifying light still shone in his eyes. Like an old lion king on the verge of death, he suddenly let out an angry roar. His entire body began to tremble violently. The last counterattack of a 9th-level ace, before death, used this kind of violent tremor as an omen. From the wooden wall behind him, the tip of a sword suddenly and noiselessly extended out. The tip of the sword only protruded out 4 inches, but it just so happened to pierce into the old Qin master's body, the third section of his tailbone. This mysterious sword thrust out and then retracted, disappearing without a trace. However, it was a fatal blow. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.